A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. I never considered myself a selfish person, but that all changed the night I found myself face to face with the thing I had cooked, something so ordinary yet so deeply unsettling, and how it pushed me to the brink of sanity. My parents worked long hours, leaving my younger siblings, Ryan, who was 9, and Lily, just 7, under my care, and on that fateful evening, I had taken a rare opportunity to experiment in the kitchen, something they usually encouraged but rarely had time for. I decided to whip up a batch of spaghetti and meatballs, a family classic that I thought they'd devour. The aroma wafted through the house, curling along the walls and wrapping around the corners, promising warmth and satisfaction. But the moment I called them to the table, their faces shifted from curiosity to disgust faster than I could blink. Ryan wrinkled his nose, pushing the plate away, while Lily, in her innocent defiance, declared she'd rather starve. I felt a wave of embarrassment flood my cheeks. After all the effort, after all the chopping and stirring, all I received were pouts and tantrums from two kids who would have preferred a cold slice of pizza or, even worse, the remnants of the last week's takeout. I tried reasoning with them, explaining how cooking was hard work, that I put my heart into this dish, but they seemed impervious to my pleas, their whining crescendoing until I felt as if my skin was crawling with irritation. Finally, I snapped, "Fine, if you don't want to eat it, don't. I won't cook you a second meal." The silence that followed was suffocating, but their half-hearted whimpers melted into fake sobs as they pushed their chairs back and skulked away, leaving me to simmer in my frustration alone. I thought they'd go to bed hungry, perhaps even learn a lesson about appreciation. Instead, it seemed I was the one cast as the villain in a twisted fairy tale. After an hour of silence thick enough to cut through, filled with the dread of impending accusations from my parents, I heard a series of soft, rhythmic thuds outside the kitchen window. I approached cautiously, peering out into the darkening yard, feeling an unsettling chill envelop me. To my disbelief, I noticed two distinct shapes just beyond the glow of the streetlight, Ryan and Lily, not playing but standing still, their backs towards me. They wore their usual pajamas, but something was off, their postures rigid like puppets with tangled strings. "What are you two doing out there?" I called, but they didn't respond, they just stood there, unmoving. A cold fear crept into my stomach. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen flickered, the sudden loss of battery rendering me helpless. I decided I'd had enough of this strange tableau and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my ears as I approached, calling their names again. As I got closer, the silhouette of my siblings twisted into something grotesque, their limbs began to twitch unnaturally, and before I could process it, they turned their heads in unison, their faces contorted into wide, eerie grins that seemed impossible for anyone who wasn't completely lost in madness. "We're not hungry anymore," they screeched in a voice that was neither of them, a chorus of distorted laughter exploding into the stillness of the night. My breath caught in my throat, a primal urge to run surged through me, but I was rooted in place, entranced by this horror unfolding before me. I backed away, but as I turned, I tripped, hitting the ground hard. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so soft I almost didn't catch it. "You said we should learn a lesson." I shot back to my feet and sprinted inside, slamming the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I tried to convince myself it was just a fever dream, that my imagination was running wild due to their refusal to eat, but in the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow glide past the window, pacing back and forth as I huddled in a corner like a child afraid of the dark. The incessant tapping began again, this time accompanied by urgent whispers that clawed at my consciousness, a language I couldn't decipher but felt deeply lodged in my psyche. I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife, adrenaline coursing as I envisioned defending myself against whatever malevolence had taken hold of my siblings. I screamed their names, but all I got in response was a cacophony that churned in my gut, mocking my distress. As the night dragged on, their laughter echoed in the surrounding darkness, a nightmarish lullaby I couldn't escape. I dared to peek outside, and my heart shattered at the fantasy. They were gone, replaced by an abyss that seemed to yawn before me. Hours passed in a daze, and when dawn finally broke, I curled into a ball on the couch, racked with guilt and dread, unsure if I would face a paranormal nightmare or the wrath of my parents. The light spilled through the window, illuminating the room in a ghostly orange hue. When I summoned the courage to look outside, the yard was empty, devoid of my siblings, free of the twisted realities that had grappled me in the night. They appeared eventually, nonchalant as ever, the peculiar grins faded like the terrors of a waking dream. I didn't mention last night's episode. After all, who would believe me? My parents returned, and everything settled back into the repetitive rhythm of the household, yet a cold thread of tension weaved itself through our lives, quiet moments punctuated by lingering glances and echoes of that laughter, my siblings seemingly unaware of the change in their demeanor, but I recognized the flicker of something darker beneath their innocent facade. Days turned into weeks, and the dread only thickened. I started finding leftovers of food I hadn't made, twisted shapes of Play-Doh like meat, unrecognizable but oddly reminiscent of what I had cooked, lurking in dark corners. I attempted to make my case known, but it sounded ludicrous, and so I buried the fear beneath daily routines, buried it until it became a constant presence, a reminder of one fateful night when I had refused to nurture. I shivered, often dreaming of the dark laughter that would not let me sleep, forever chained to the guilt that grew like a weed. And one night, when the winds whispered through the cracks of our home, I dared to lay my head in resigned silence, but was pulled back into that heavy absence, my siblings out once more, standing like specters beneath the streetlights, faces illuminated in a sickly hue, as if a portal had cracked open between realms, and I was forced to face a harbinger of dread, knowing that somewhere inside I had sealed our fates the day I decided to abandon the very essence of what it meant to share a meal. As I gazed upon their twisted forms, I desperately wished to retract my words, to cook them anything they wanted, though I feared the cost would be far more than a second dinner, and the shadows hinted that the lesson had only just begun to unravel. AITA for leaving the room after my BF surprised me. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Brad had been working tirelessly for months, and I thought he finally wanted to treat us to some much-needed relaxation at his family's cabin in the woods, just the two of us. I should have felt lucky, but as the sun dipped below the horizon on our first night, I sensed something was off. After a lovely dinner, Brad insisted we take a stroll outside to gaze at the stars, a romantic gesture, I thought, but when we reached the clearing, he pulled out a flashlight and shone it onto a crudely carved face on a tree. "Isn't that creepy?" He laughed, but I just felt a chill run down my spine. It looked like a distorted version of a human face, its mouth stretched wide in an unnatural grin. I jokingly told him it reminded me of a horror movie, but Brad's laughter faded into something more serious as he pointed out the countless other carvings littering the trees around us, each one more sinister than the last. It felt like we had stumbled into the hideout of a deranged artist. I suggested we head back, my instincts screaming at me that this was not just a scenic getaway but perhaps something else entirely, yet he insisted on taking a closer look, thrill-seeking gleaming in his eyes as he veered deeper into the woods, and I followed reluctantly, the growing darkness around us feeling more oppressive with each step. That's when I stumbled upon an old makeshift altar tucked away behind the trees, adorned with a grotesque collection of animal bones and what looked like dried flowers, and I froze, dread coiling in my stomach as a realization dawned upon me that this wasn't just an innocent surprise. Brad's sense of adventure had led us into something dark and ancient, perhaps a ritual of some sort that beckoned us into its fold. When I nervously voiced my unease, Brad just chuckled and insisted it was all just part of the fun. In his mind, it was another wacky challenge to conquer. That night was a canvas waiting for our adventures to color it, but I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching us, a presence that made my skin crawl, and when I looked back to him, I no longer recognized my boyfriend. The glint in his eyes was wild, as if the forest itself had wrapped him in its cruel grasp. I turned to leave, my heart pounding, but he laughed again, telling me I was being dramatic, and pulled my arm, the grip tightening until I yanked away, the laughter fading to an intensity that made my blood run cold. It hit me then that the woods weren't just alive, but they had a heartbeat and it wasn't friendly. "This isn't funny, Brad." I almost screamed as panic bubbled in my chest, but he could barely contain himself, entwining a lock of my hair around his fingers, looking past me as if I were an obstacle blocking him from the greater thrill lurking in the shadows. The air thickened, charged with a tension I couldn't shake and screaming at me to run, but for some reason, I didn't. I felt like I was watching my own life play out in front of me, a puppet on strings I couldn't control. Brad leaned in, whispering something I could no longer hear, his breath brushing against my neck in a way that sent electric shivers down my spine, and then it happened. Behind him, from the darkness, emerged something human-shaped, its limbs crooked and elongated, lurking with a predatory stillness as if it were mimicking the worst parts of humanity. Its gaze locked onto me, pinning me in place, and I fought with every fiber of my being not to scream. It was a body, I realized, a sick parody of a human form, its skin taut and pale as if stretched over too many bones, and I could almost see it smile, formed not from joy but something more sinister, something avid and hungry. I stumbled backward, my survival instincts kicking in, and without a second thought, I bolted back toward the cabin, half glancing over my shoulder to witness the horror unfold as Brad turned, his look of excitement morphing into confusion, then anger as he called out after me, a distorted echo against the trees. I flung myself into the cabin, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding in rhythm from my panic as I frantically locked it, breathing heavy as I sank to the floor, the oppressive quiet of the retreating woods wrapping around me. But it didn't take long before I could hear him pounding on the door, his voice shifting to an angry holler as he demanded I let him in, that I was overreacting, that it was all just part of the surprise. I wanted to scream back, to explain that something had changed in him, that whatever he had become was a stranger, but the dread pulled deeper, shoving all logic aside as I crouched between the couch and a coffee table, praying the darkness would hold me tight. The house felt like a coffin, the night seeped through the walls, mocking my isolation as I reached for my phone, just wanting to call someone, anyone, but when I turned it on, it was dead, an unexpected betrayal that froze the blood in my veins. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear, and the silence that loomed outside felt thicker, a presence lingering just out of sight, and when I finally mustered the courage to peer through the window, my breath caught in my throat. Brad stood looking towards me, uncharacteristically still, shadowed by the trees, but in that moment, the woods seemed to breathe with him, the upside-down grin plastered on his face wider than before. I realized then that whatever he had confronted out there, whatever darkness he had engaged with, had seeped into his very essence, reshaping him into something unrecognizable, and all at once, fear surged. He would come back to the door, but it wouldn't be Brad. I felt it deep in my bones that I had wandered into something that wouldn't allow me to leave easily. My heart raced as shadows danced behind him, flashes of twisted figures lurking in the moonlight, and time seemed to lose sense as the night wore on, every call and pound on the door drowning in an abyss that threatened to devour me whole, and I knew then that the hardest choice lay before me, to wait in agonizing uncertainty or to escape while I still could, but the truth gnawed at me. The person I fell in love with might already be gone, replaced by a reflection of an ancient ritual's hunger, festering beneath the guise I once trusted. Ultimately, I did the only thing I could. I grabbed my bag and slipped out through the back, terrified but driven by the primal instinct to survive, running into the woods with my heart racing, the weight of the foreboding night chasing me as I looked back just once, only to see Brad, the distorted figure in the darkness, staring back, the woods swelling around him, wrapping him in their embrace, and in that haunting moment, I knew I wasn't just running from him, I was escaping an entity that had taken his place, a dark truth that clung to me like an omen, whispering that if I ever looked back, I might join him, too. I used to think family dinners were sacred, a time when laughter echoed and memories were created, but that all changed when Uncle Greg, who has an uncanny ability to slip venomous remarks into jovial conversations, decided to comment on my smile. It was supposed to be a routine Sunday evening. My mother had spent the entire day cooking her famous lasagna while my father polished his collection of vintage wine, and the aroma normally brought me a sense of comfort. As we gathered around the oversized table, my mother's excitement was palpable as she presented the meal, her warm smile contrasting sharply with the chill that settled in the air as Uncle Greg leaned in, eyes glinting with mischief, and said, "What happened to your smile, anyway? It looks different." At that moment, a thunderbolt struck within me. My mind raced back to the summer I turned 14, the summer my childhood was ripped from me when I discovered Vine, a predator masquerading as a social media platform where I was the star of ridicule with a series of leaked videos that showcased my awkwardness and strange, crooked grin, dictated by the braces that had turned me into a target for the school bullies. Laughter had morphed into tears, and that distant, carefree girl was just a haunting memory as my smile had become a mask for my pain, a fragile shield behind which I'd concealed years of insecurity and self-loathing. I froze, feeling the eyes of my entire family on me. The youngest cousins were giggling by the dessert plates, my older sister was nervously flicking her gaze between me and my uncle, and my parents were exchanging worried looks, as if they could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface, the air thick with tension waiting to burst. Then, before I knew it, the acidic words were spilling from my mouth like a torrent. "What's wrong with my smile?" The table fell silent, forks paused midair, and for a fraction of a second, time felt suspended. Uncle Greg chuckled, half in jest and half in malice. "What happened to the girl who used to light up the room with that dorky grin?" I could see it then, the flicker of glee in his eyes as if my vulnerability nourished him. In that instant, the jubilant laughter of the evening faded into an oppressive silence, and with every ounce of grief I harbored, I vented, unleashing suppressed anger and frustration that spiraled into a whirlwind of words, attacking not just Greg but the entire facade of family gatherings, laying bare the scars that were traditionally covered with laughter. Do you think I want to be reminded of how different I am? Of the countless nights I spent crying in front of a mirror wishing to fit in? And as I spoke, it was as though a dam broke. My family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the shock of the sudden outburst tangling their hearts in conflicting emotions. My mother looked hurt, as though I'd pulled back the curtain on a family secret, while my father, usually the peacemaker, sat, wide-eyed, surprised at the tempest that had erupted from his adoring daughter. Then it happened. My sister, usually the calmest of us all, stepped in, her face pale as she bitterly remarked, "You're not a walking tragedy. Get a grip. This is just a dinner." The words snapped like a rubber band, ricocheting through the room and into every soul present. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. What was once an ambient family gathering had transformed into a battleground where everyone was armed with unspoken feelings. It felt surreal, our laughter replaced by an awkwardness thick enough to slice. I felt lost, standing amidst the wreckage of my own emotions, the insult consuming me, gnawing at my insides. I could see my uncle's pleasure, feeding on the drama he had awakened, and it infuriated me further. Why couldn't they understand that family should be a sanctuary, a place I could shield myself from the world's cruelties? And when I finally saw my father's gaze, a mix of pity and disappointment, I realized I had crossed a line that would never be uncrossed. The dinner plates were forgotten, the clinking of utensils was replaced by my heaving breaths, and the tension became palpable, everyone holding their breath, teetering on the edge of the abyss. Then Mom, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and sorrow, finally spoke, her voice trembling, "You've ruined this dinner, all of you. Greg, you need to learn when to keep your mouth shut, and you." She turned to me, disappointment etched across her features. "You should know better than to let it get to you. We're family." I gaped, the weight of it hitting me like a freight train. I had acted out, sure, but so had Uncle Greg, yet somehow, I was the villain in this narrative. As the discomfort and hostility wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket, I felt detached, an observer in my own life, watching the family I once adored crumble under the strain of unaddressed grievances and unexpressed emotions. I stormed out, tears cascading down my cheeks as the darkened evening air hit me. I didn't hear the poker-faced exchanges or the strained whispers following my exit. I simply wrapped my arms around my knees under the stars, wondering if I had truly ruined the dinner or merely laid bare the fractures that had always lurked beneath the surface, awaiting the perfect moment to shatter our fragile facade. As the night wore on, the moon hung heavy with judgment, and deep down, I felt it, the feeling that perhaps we were all broken, cracking beneath the weight of unspoken words, yet desperate to pretend we were fine. But for one fleeting moment, amidst the chaos and heartbreak, I wished someone would have just acknowledged the depth of my hurt, instead of dismissing me as the antagonist of the family drama and making me wonder if, maybe, it was time to stop pretending those cracks didn't exist. The reality was, we each wore our own masks. Uncle Greg wore his of laughter while my family donned theirs of indifference, and that night, I unveiled mine, the one marred by hurt but precious in its truth, and I realized, maybe, the real tragedy wasn't in my smile but in the silence that had allowed them to linger. Last year, when my wife and I were expecting our daughter, we picked a beautiful name, Lila. It was a name that flowed like a gentle breeze, filled with warmth and kindness. Yet, shortly after her birth, something terrifying happened that turned our lives inside out and left me questioning my own sanity. It was a typical night. Lila had just been put down, and the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you and feels almost sacred. That's when I heard it, a soft whispering coming from the nursery. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the creaks of an old house settling into the chilling night. But as I listened more closely, I distinctly heard someone call her name, Lila. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I quietly crept to the door and peered through the small crack. There was no one in there, just the crib, the soft mobile spinning lazily above, and Lila, sleeping soundly, blissfully unaware of the sinister shadow that had seeped into our home. Thankfully, she was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, like we'd crossed into a realm we weren't supposed to. Over the next few weeks, the haunting whispers continued, and weird things began happening. Once, I swear I saw the outline of a child's handprint on the nursery window, even though I hadn't let anyone near the house. Every time I brought it up to my wife, she shrugged it off as postpartum nerves, urging me to seek help. But it wasn't my sanity that I questioned, these were real manifestations, something darker than our mundane life. It got even stranger when one night, I awoke to Lila's cries echoing through the house. Rushing into the room, I found her wide-eyed, fixated on the corner of the room, her tiny finger pointed at something invisible. I panicked and scooped her up, trembling as I felt the weight of whatever unseen presence loomed near us. I knew I had to do something. I became obsessed, scouring the internet for anything that could explain this phenomenon. That's when I stumbled upon countless forums, each filled with heart-wrenching stories of children who seemed to have a connection to the ethereal realm, many accompanied by bizarre, folklore-inspired names. Suddenly, it all clicked. The name Lila derived from ancient roots and was tied to an old lore I could scarcely comprehend, a name said to call forth spirits from beyond, suggesting that perhaps my daughter was more than just my little girl, she could be a vessel for something unfathomable. With each ghostly whisper that echoed through the walls, the urgency of change became palpable. I approached my wife with what I'd learned, fearful and desperate. I suggested we consider changing Lila's name, perhaps to something less steeped in mystery and darkness, something that could sever any ties to the unsettling occurrences that now surrounded her. But she was vehemently opposed, her heart set on the name that laced our daughter's identity with beauty. "You can't just change it because you're scared of shadows," she yelled, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. "What kind of parent would do that? You're being irrational." In that moment, a chasm formed between us, split by fear and misunderstanding. Our relationship began to unravel, arguing over what felt like life or death to me became the new normal, my wife seeing me not as a caring father but as a paranoid lunatic. And then the horrors escalated. One evening, as I sat watching a movie with the sound turned low, I became acutely aware of Lila's cries rising like a siren in the night. I moved instinctively, racing to her room and coming to an abrupt stop at the threshold. The room was cast in shadows, but I swear I saw a figure hovering at Lila's crib, its dark form shrouded in an unsettling aura. I bolted forward, the adrenaline sending my heart into a frenzy, but as I grasped Lila in my arms, the figure dissipated, leaving nothing but the haunting feeling of being watched, as if time slowed and reality warped around me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was convinced that Lila was in danger, and if I didn't act soon, something irreparable would happen. Frustrated and alone, I began calling her by different names in the hopes of masking the darkness lurking just beyond our world: Rose, Lily, even Daisy. My daughter, thank God, seemed content, cooing and gurgling in response, but my wife grew furious, hurling insults when I refused to use her chosen name. "You're making a mockery of our daughter," she screamed at me, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She deserves better than a father who's too scared to face his own demons." Each confrontation felt like nails on a chalkboard, deepening the rift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trying to keep Lila safe. But then it happened. One night, as I lay beside her on the bed, I awoke suddenly, drenched in sweat, a weight bearing down on my chest. I turned to check on her. Lila was gone. The nursery door stood ajar, and dread consumed me. I quickly bolted upright, racing through the dark corridors until I found her. She wasn't in her room. I searched the house, a panic setting in, with every shadow feeling alive. Just as I was about to scream her name, I heard a giggle from behind the living room curtain. I yanked it aside, and there she was, standing and staring at what seemed to be a swirling mass of darkness in the corner of the room. "Lila," I croaked, but she didn't respond. Instead, her hands stretched out toward the void, my heart shattering as the whispers grew louder, mingling with her innocent laughter. "I'm sorry," I cried, feeling every ounce of regret spill from my mouth. "We can change it. We can change your name." But the moment felt futile, as if I were shouting into a void that would consume me whole. My daughter took a step forward, and as if the very essence of the thing she faced reached out, I saw her eyes turn dark, swallowed up by a vortex I couldn't see but felt deep in my bones. Just before all resonance was lost, I lunged, snatching her up and stumbling back, my heart racing as the air around us crackled with energy. In that split second, I understood, whatever was trying to pull her in wanted her. It wanted her because of her name. Without a second thought, I screamed, "Your name isn't Lila anymore. It's Rose." The air shifted with a chilling breeze, and the darkness in the room suddenly flickered, as if contemplating its grip. I grasped her tighter, expecting every spine-tingling whisper to break me down, but it withdrew, and Lila blinked up at me, eyes wide, as if she hadn't even registered the chaos around her. I took that moment to flee, racing to my wife, who stood paralyzed in the doorway, horror etched upon her face. "We need to change her name, we need to save her," I yelled, my voice frantic, but as I spoke, I saw the realization darken my wife's eyes. I was no longer the doting father, I had become the enemy. "You've gone too far," she screamed, thrusting one hand at me, the other clutching Lila tightly. "I will never forgive you for this." And then it all crashed down. My family and I were caught in an unending battle, one I never wanted. I was left with two choices: protect my daughter from an unseen force hell-bent on claiming her soul, or face a new terror, losing the only family I ever wanted because I dared to act on a fear that was dehumanizing my love. So here I am, battling between love and fear, asking everyone if I'm the asshole for refusing to change my daughter's name. But how do you explain there's something darker lurking just beyond the veil of understanding? Something that whispers when the wind blows, waiting for weakness to snatch away the light. Would you change something innocent to preserve what you love? Is it easier to accept loss than to fight through shadows? I wonder if I might lose them both, my Lila and the warmth of my wife, so I ask you, Ida? Last Thanksgiving, I found myself in a moral quandary that still chills my bones when I think back on it. My girlfriend, Mia, had a cherished family tradition of gathering every year at her grandmother's sprawling old house in the woods, a house that everyone claimed was haunted, though Mia always laughed it off as just a local legend. This year, however, I had planned a weekend fishing trip with my friends, something we had organized weeks in advance and were all looking forward to. I felt torn. Should I attend the obligatory family gathering where I'd be the outsider, or honor my pre-existing commitment? In a moment of selfishness, I chose my friends over her family's tradition, hoping it wouldn't cause too many ripples in our relationship. As soon as I made the decision, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I was already feeling bad when I woke up Thanksgiving morning to a deluge of messages and missed calls from Mia, her voice frantic as she told me her grandmother had fallen ill and there wouldn't be any gathering. Instead, she encouraged me to enjoy my trip, but guilt clawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been supportive enough. The fishing trip was almost as disappointing as it was cathartic. Every cast of my line reminded me of the warmth of family, and all I could picture was Mia's disappointment plastered across her face. As the day dragged on, though, I dismissed my worries, shrugging them off with my friends, feigning laughter as they told ghost stories around the campfire. But as night swallowed the camp in darkness, I noticed something odd, a sudden, chilling silence in the woods. The crickets stopped their chirping, and the wind held its breath. I could swear I felt eyes watching us from the shadows. Unease settled like lead in my stomach. In an attempt to shake the feeling, I stepped away from the fire, venturing into the trees on the pretext of needing to find a restroom. It wasn't long before I found myself walking deeper into the woods than intended, the moonlight barely cutting through the branches overhead. Each step was heavy, as if something sinister lurked just beyond the reach of the dim light. I turned back, heart racing, but that's when I heard the first of the whispers, soft, echoey, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Come play with us," it called, in a sing-song voice that sent icy chills down my spine. My blood ran cold as I immediately thought of the ghost stories my friends were telling. What if we had ventured too far into something that shouldn't be disturbed? I quickened my pace, trying to shake it off, but the whispers followed me back, only growing louder and more insistent. I stumbled upon what looked like an old, decrepit shack, forgotten and crumbling, draped with vines. It felt like a bad idea, but something pulled me closer, against my better judgment. Knocking on the rotten door, I felt an unnatural chill seep through my skin. The door creaked open without my touch, revealing an empty room consumed by shadows, where sunlight dared not intrude. I hesitated but stepped inside, curiosity overpowering fear. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, every instinct screamed for me to leave, but the whispers had morphed into a haunting melody that enchanted me. I turned towards a dim glimmer at the back, only for the door to slam shut behind me, locking me in darkness. Panic surged as I rattled the door, screaming for help, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. The whispers turned to gasps, a cacophony that reverberated off the walls. Then, just like that, they formed words: "You shouldn't have come here." I recoiled, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I saw them, children, their faces pale and hollowed, drifting through the cracks in the walls, their eyes void of warmth, staring into my soul. "You're not supposed to be here," one of them whispered, clutching my leg with a cold, trembling hand. I felt sick. This place was a prison, a nightmare trapped inside a nightmare, echoing with the spirits of those who had lost their way. I fought against the whispers, pushed against the walls of darkness, the memory of Mia losing its hold on me as the weight of despair thickened the air. I couldn't let her down, but I felt tethered to this cursed place, as if its despair were latching onto my essence. Just then, I heard footsteps outside. My friends had come looking for me. I cried out, "Help me!" But my voice was drowned in the whispers. The door rattled as they struggled to open it. And, in a moment of clarity, I realized I had to fight back against whatever this place was trying to take from me. Summoning my last reserve of strength, I hurled against the door one final time, battering it as cold fingers released their hold. I felt space open up, light cutting through the darkness. My friends pushed through, pulling me into the safety of the night. Breathless and trembling, I fell to my knees, gasping for air while the shack stood ominously behind us, silent and still. I could still hear the whispers as they faded, mingling with the wind. "You shouldn't have come," echoed softly. Shaken, I collected myself as my friends were confused, asking what had happened. I only managed to tell them I'd gotten lost when I realized I'd been gone too long. I didn't dare tell them about the whispers, about the children, about the darkness, fearing they might have walked into our very own horror story. The next day, I returned to Mia, guilt seeping into every moment. When she asked how my trip went, I smiled faintly and said it was good, suppressing the fear clawing at my insides. A few days later, her family sent out a notice that they would be selling the old house. Apparently, her grandmother had died the night I'd gotten lost. The unease returned, wrapping its fingers around my throat as the fog of dread settled back in. I realized then that I was haunted not just by the spirits of that place, but by the decision I'd made, the choice to ignore something important, something that cost more than just a gathering. To this day, the whispers linger in the back of my mind, a reminder of the tradition I snubbed, the pain I caused. I sometimes wonder if part of me is still trapped inside that shack, lost among the shadows, and I can't help but bring it up to my friends, hoping they will understand someday. But deep down, I know the truth, it's too late for that. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation that blurred the lines between right and wrong, but as I stood outside the theater, the vibrant energy of the evening dulled by a series of increasingly impatient glances, I wondered if I had crossed an invisible boundary. I was there to see Wicked, a show I'd been looking forward to for months, and as the line wrapped around the building under the bright streetlights, anticipation thickened in the air. My phone buzzed incessantly with eager messages from friends eager to meet after the show, but I was determined to shut it out and soak up the excitement. That's when I saw her, a woman, mid-30s, vibrant red hair cascading over her shoulders, standing right in front of me, engrossed in an animated phone conversation that seemed all too important to her. I tried to ignore the growing annoyance in my chest and drowned out her loud laughter, but every witty retort and self-indulgent chuckle felt like a dagger driving deeper into the heart of my evening. I mean, come on. Some of us were here to enjoy an extraordinary performance, not to witness private conversations at full volume. As the minutes ticked down to the start time, my irritation boiled over. "Excuse me." I mustered the courage to call out, the sound of my voice slicing through the buzz of excited chatter. She turned, her surprised eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Can you please be a little quieter? Some of us actually want to enjoy the pre-show." The words rushed out like bile. A ripple of silence fell over the line, all eyes now glued to us. I could feel the weight of judgment in the air. What was supposed to be a brief moment of assertive clarity had turned into a live performance for the waiting crowd. Instead of shrinking back like I expected, she exploded. "Aren't you just the biggest little snob?" Her voice heightened, dripping with sarcasm. She held the phone in one hand, brandishing it like a sword, and her laughter abruptly transformed into a high-pitched giggle as if she were mocking me. "Maybe if some of us weren't so uptight, we'd get to enjoy the show a bit more. Ever think of that?" Each word hit hard, like stones thrown in anger, igniting a ripple of laughter behind her as her friends rallied around the charge. My fists clenched at my sides, the blood pounding in my ears so loudly I could barely hear my thoughts. I could see other theatergoers carving out their opinion in the way they looked at me, a mix of sympathy and disapproval. It was then that a realization struck, a crack in my composure. Maybe I was being unreasonable, but that didn't stop my temper from flaring, and before I knew it, I yelled back, maybe you don't need to share every detail of your miserable life with the world. Ever think some of us are here to escape it? The gasp from the crowd was palpable, like a sudden intake of breath before an intense scene. The woman's face twisted in disbelief, her laughter abruptly cut off, leaving a painful silence hanging in the chilly night air. An angry flush crept up my neck, and just when I thought the moment might pass, she stepped closer, her eyes narrowed and her voice dropping to a whisper, bitter and low. You think this is a show for you to escape to? You've only scratched the surface of what life can throw at you, and let me tell you, and I know you won't believe me, this is nothing compared to real pain. I felt something twist in my gut at the challenge in her gaze, a feeling that there was more at play than just a rude theatergoer. Each heartbeat echoed with my growing unease, and the crowd around us felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for a resolution to this absurdity that had taken on a life of its own. She was right, in a way. How could I know what monsters lurked in her reality? But as the theater doors swung open, spilling warm light and murmurs of music out into the cool night air, I realized I didn't care. I was tired, too tired, of dealing with selfish people in a world that oftentimes felt far too chaotic. Without thinking, I waved her off dismissively, my voice laced with frustration. Whatever. Enjoy your unnecessary phone call. That must have struck a nerve, because she glanced back at me for a split second before rejoining her group of friends, and just as quickly as the confrontation had begun, it fizzled. I was left there, feeling the weight of my anger linger, tangled with something more profound, an unsettling sense of dread. The show started, and I tried to immerse myself in the enchantment of emerald green costumes and soaring melodies, but her laughter still rang in my ears, creating a friction in my mind I couldn't shake. What if she's right? My own thoughts haunted me like phantoms as I watched the story unfold on stage, the vibrant colors slipping by but never fully capturing my attention. Images of her piercing green eyes, that moment of shared rage, replayed in my mind. Who was I to judge anyone's choices, especially when my own life felt tangled and unpredictable? Then something shifted. I noticed she was sitting 2 rows down from me as the act wore on, and to my dismay, they were still laughing, still talking, this time at a whisper, but clearly still engaged with their phones, still distracting in ways that made me grit my teeth. The frustration boiled over again until I could stand it no longer. I stood up, heart pounding, and hissed, "Can you please just put your phones away and watch the show?" The words felt like fire leaping from my throat, but all they earned me was a triumphant glance from the woman. It was as if she was waiting for this, even expecting me to lash out again, and that was when I knew it was no longer about her phone call. It was an insidious dance of power and pride, and I was entrapped. She casually leaned back, smirk lacing her features. "You really think making this a bigger spectacle makes you some kind of hero?" She shot back, laughter bubbling from her lips, buoyed by the cheers of her friends. My blood turned to ice, and it dawned on me, I was being played. Her deliberate entrapment had turned the heat of my anger into a fiery embarrassment. Just as I recoiled, I felt a deep pull of anxiety fill the recesses of my mind, like an extreme panic gnawing at me, and I sank back into my seat, overwhelmed. I was now the unwitting star of a show I didn't intend to be in, and all I wanted was to disappear. After the final curtain call, I stumbled out onto the streets, a numbing shame seeping into my bones. I was both the villain and the fool, caught in a careless confrontation that had turned the joyous night sour. But as I walked away, I couldn't quite shake the sense that this experience had changed something within me. It was no longer just about her phone call, it was a mirror reflecting my own failings and a story that continued on without me, left to fester on the streets as I disappeared into the night. Was I the asshole for yelling? Maybe. But the truth stung brighter than any shame. Honesty splintered in a way I hadn't expected. My life was messy, and sometimes boundaries need to be drawn, even at the cost of losing sight of the enchantment a show could bring. So maybe, just maybe, the real question was, could I forgive myself for demanding silence in a world filled with chaos, or chalk it all up to an unhappy accident never to be resolved? I always thought that family gatherings were supposed to be joyful, filled with laughter and love, but for me, they were a reminder of the hollow ache in my heart, a wound that never seemed to heal. I had been married for 3 years, and despite countless doctor's appointments, hormones, and shattered hopes, I still hadn't been able to give my husband what his family craved, a grandchild. It's not that I didn't share their dream. I wanted a child as much as he did, but an insidious cloud of infertility hung over my head like a guillotine, waiting to drop at any moment. At every family dinner, the conversation would inevitably spiral toward the kids my sister-in-law was expecting or the cute stories of my husband's childhood that I had heard 1,000 times, both of which sent a fresh wave of salt water stinging my eyes that I would fight to keep at bay. As the chatter became more pronounced, I noticed the unmistakable glances my mother-in-law would cast my way, the pitying concern pooled in her eyes like the still water of a stagnant pond. I could feel her discomfort, her insistent attempts to engage me in discussions about fertility treatments under the guise of concern and support. I hated it. I hated the unwelcome attention on my most vulnerable secret, the nagging whispers that echoed through my mind. I wasn't just a woman, but a broken cog in her family's wheel. It all came to a head last Thanksgiving, the air thick with expectation as the aroma of roasted turkey drifted into my nostrils like a false promise. After we had feasted, my in-laws gathered in the living room, eyes glistening under the faded twinkle lights, chatting animatedly about future family plans. My heart raced as I sensed the shift in focus toward me, the moment when my mother-in-law cleared her throat, the precursor to her infamous "let's talk about the future" speech. "So, when do you think we might meet our grandchild?" she pried, her voice steady, though I could hear the tremor of underlying desperation. It was as if every pair of eyes turned to me with that question, the words swirling in the air like vultures, scavenging the carcass of my dreams. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks and wanted to sink into the floor, to evaporate, but instead, with a jagged breath, I simply remained silent. My husband shot me a concerned glance, his father deflected with an awkward chuckle, but the damage was done. I felt raw, exposed, and utterly furious. Why should I have to discuss my deepest pain with people who only saw me as a vessel? That evening, as tension simmered beneath the surface, I retreated to the bathroom, clutching the cool porcelain sink, my heart racing as I battled the swirling storm of emotions. The shadows seemed to whisper, urging me to confront my in-laws about the delicate matter, to reveal the truth that felt more sacramental than flesh and blood. But all I could recall was a memory, the time I had briefly shared my struggles with close friends only to hear their casual insensitivity. "You can always adopt," was an unsolicited suggestion that had dug in like nails on a chalkboard. How could I trust anyone with this? Instead of expressing my frustrations, I turned my phone off and avoided them for the rest of the evening, feigning late-night work calls and bathroom breaks to escape their probing questions. When I returned to the living room, the chatter had shifted to other topics: my sister-in-law's baby shower planning, the grand plans summer would bring, all accompanied by the laughter and affection I had once thought unbreakable. I sat back down, feeling smaller than ever as my in-laws and husband conversed with ease, laughter cascading over me like a heavy wool blanket. I couldn't help but think that I had become a ghost in my own life, floating through moments that once filled me with joy but now only reminded me of the family I was struggling to provide. In the days that followed, our house grew quiet, almost painfully so. My husband, kind and patient, tried to forge conversations around my feelings, but all I felt was a wall robbing me of my voice. I became a coward, staring down the never-ending silence whenever my in-laws called or texted. Their messages turned from curious to frustrating, filled with concern that made my skin crawl. A week later, the family WhatsApp group ignited with photographs of my sister-in-law's ultrasound, and a tear slipped down my cheek as I muted the notification, each ping a dagger twisting into my heart. I felt like the villain of my own story, the one who refused to talk about the very thing that drained life from me. In my mind, I played a relentless cycle of what-ifs. What if I talk to them? What if I shatter their dreams? What if I shatter my own? I could feel the weight of family traditions and expectations pressing down on me like I was being submerged underwater, gasping for breath and desperate for release. As the cold chill of winter set in, I avoided attending holiday celebrations, ducking out of every gathering, and insisting on working through the long weekends, all while my heart sank deeper into despair. Then came the shocking twist. One late night, while scrolling aimlessly through social media, I stumbled upon a group dedicated to fertility issues, and suddenly, there it was, a thread that ripped the bandage off the wound I had tried to shield from the world. A woman, vulnerable and raw, told of her struggles and gave voice to the very pain I feared, and I felt it resonate within me like a forgotten song. As the comments poured in, each a testament to the shared struggle, it felt like a glimmer of hope. Until she casually mentioned, "Just remember to communicate with your loved ones, they can't help you if they don't know." Her words clung to the walls of my mind, pressing against the restraints I had put in place. That night, I finally broke down, tears flowing freely as I thought of my husband, the love we shared, and the family I had allowed to slip farther away. The next day, I took a deep breath, my heart still racing, and initiated a text to my in-laws asking them to meet me for coffee. I had finally decided, it was time to talk. The moment my mother-in-law walked into the cafe, I saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, only to be overshadowed by the uncertainty of what lay beneath. We chatted about benign topics for a while, but the air was thick with unspoken words. As the steam from our drinks rose like ephemeral ghosts, I finally opened my mouth, feeling the weight of every word crash down around us like waves against the shore. I spoke of my struggles, the heartache, and the silence that had become my wall. They listened in silence, and in those moments, when the truth laid bare between us, I felt the temperature drop, an awkward pause settling like dust after a storm. To my surprise, after a few beats of silence, my mother-in-law reached across the table, her hand clutching mine, offering more than just sympathy, it was the promise of understanding. I finally began to heal, slowly but surely, yet the path wasn't easy. Some days, I faltered, the weight of expectations still looming over me, but I knew that mothering would come in many forms, perhaps not the expected route, but one that was uniquely mine. As time progressed, I became part of those family conversations, advocating for my own journey to expand our family, while embracing the unexpected joys that awaited us, understanding that familial love is resilient and can be found even in the spaces of discomfort and raw honesty. Sharing my story didn't only help my in-laws understand the pain I carried, it liberated me from its grip, transforming the way we could interact with one another. I wouldn't be the perfect daughter-in-law or the perfect mother, but I would be something far richer, an authentic member of a family that, in its messy, imperfect beauty, could truly embrace one another for who we are. Even after all the pain, I found myself craving those family gatherings, looking forward to laughter, to the inevitable questions, but also knowing that this time, I'd be able to talk about the dreams that had once felt so out of reach. So, AITA for refusing to talk to my in-laws? No, I realized, I was just human, and sometimes it takes a little courage to find the voice that lays dormant within. I never thought a weekend getaway with my boyfriend and his family would leave me questioning my sanity, but here we are, with the shadows of the house enveloping me like a dark quilt of dread. It started innocently enough, with laughter filling the cozy air of his parents' cabin in the woods. We were greeted with warm hugs and the promise of memorable times, but as night fell, something felt off. The first evening, everything seemed fine, the arrangements were simple, two couples sleeping in respective bedrooms, and I felt comfortable nestled next to my boyfriend. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that his brother, Aaron, and his wife, Tara, were being overly favorable. They had just had a baby, which in turn shifted the dynamics. Everyone seems to tiptoe around them, as if their new little bundle of joy had installed an invisible hierarchy. The next morning, while I made coffee in the dim light of the kitchen, I overheard whispers in the living room, Aaron and Tara discussing how much easier they'd sleep in their own space and how much they appreciated the flexible accommodations this weekend. My mind raced. Flexible? I felt a lump form in my throat. We had less privacy because they brought their newborn, but nobody had bothered to consider how it would affect us. That night, I realized the sleeping arrangements had shifted again. Instead of sharing the queen bed in the guest room with my boyfriend, he was being shuttled to the living room sofa by his parents, while Aaron and Tara insisted on taking the guest room for the sake of the baby. The indignation rose in me like bile, and I couldn't hold back. When we gathered around the dinner table, I drew a deep breath and questioned why our plans had changed. I thought we were supposed to share the guest room, I probed, venom drenching my words despite my best efforts. His parents exchanged knowing glances, and I could feel tension crackling in the air like static. Ah, sweetheart, we made accommodations for Aaron and Tara. You understand, right? My boyfriend's mother, Brenda, responded in that sugary tone meant to placate, but I tasted the bitterness. No, I don't understand. We're all adults here, I don't see why their sleeping arrangement takes precedence. My voice was louder than I intended, and every pair of eyes locked onto me, filled with a mix of shock and disbelief. Tara is nursing, Aaron's voice broke through like ice, sharp and accusing. What do you expect us to do? Suddenly, the laughter of earlier seemed like a distant memory, and the room became thick with unspoken words and judgment. The dinner turned into an awkward game of silence, heavy and foreboding, and I felt utterly alone despite being surrounded by family. Yet, the more I stewed in my indignation, the more I longed for clarity, for some shred of acknowledgement that the unfairness was real. As darkness enveloped the cabin, I lay curled around the edges of myself, silence stalking me like a predator, and I could hear the soft cooings of the baby and the muffled laughter of the others in the living room. I slipped out into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, frustrated and lost. I could hear my boyfriend's breath beneath the sofa as I tiptoed past the open guest bedroom, where the shadows cast by the nightlight danced ominously across the walls. The room felt cursed, a trap designed to keep me from reclaiming my sanity. It was then that I overheard a conversation drifting from the living room, cloaked in laughter and familiarity. "She really needs to mind her place," Brenda said, and each of her words felt like a knife cutting into me. "I just don't know why we're coddling her. It's not like she's family." My heart dropped like a stone in a well, the implications crashed over me, and suddenly, the realization that I was considered other in this family simmered under my skin. I mustered the courage and stepped back into their world, a world painted in shades of favoritism and bias. "Why am I being pushed aside?" I demanded, standing firm despite the quaking in my voice. The laughter halted, and all eyes swung toward me. "I'm not asking for special treatment, I just want to be treated equally." They shifted uncomfortably as I forced them to confront the truth that hung in the air, thick as fog. I could see the irritation flare in Aaron's eyes, while Tara remained quietly smug, nursing their sweet little privilege. "You're overreacting," Brenda scoffed, and I could feel heat coursing through my veins, a bubbling cauldron of adrenaline. "No, I'm fighting for fairness," I shot back, feeling a strange empowerment surge within me. The tension unraveled as Aaron slammed his fist on the table, rising to meet me, his face flushed with anger. "You think you deserve something special just because you're dating our brother? Get real." It felt like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I regretted voicing my frustrations, until I saw the conflict brewing behind my boyfriend's eyes. I could tell he was torn, caught between the impulse to defend me and the suffocating loyalty to his family that had been drummed into him since he was little. Finally, instead of collapsing under the weight of their cruel laughter, I turned my back on the room and marched out towards the exit. I needed air, fresh and untarnished, away from the clutches of their toxicity. As I reached the front porch, the moon hung low, bathing everything in a silvery hue that strangely felt like a blessing. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the fragrant pine, and my mind spun in circles, torn between loyalty and the burgeoning realization of who I am. Suddenly, the door behind me creaked open. I turned slowly to see my boyfriend standing there, a mix of shame and sorrow in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice shaky. "I should have said something." But as he said it, I realized that words often mean nothing without action. And in that moment, wrapped in the solitude of darkness, I understood something terrifying. I was the outsider here. "You can't apologize if you don't mean it," I said, my heart breaking with every syllable. His face fell, and the heaviness of my own truth rooted me to the spot. I wanted to run but instead felt the weight of the world on my shoulders as realization sank in. What was I, if not a mere guest in a house that should have felt like home? But as the night unfolded, the silence became a canvas where I painted the chilling realization: sometimes the truth is that you don't belong, even when love is tangled in the mess. And as my feet pushed me away from the cabin, echoes of their laughter haunting my ears like shadows, I knew I had crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed, and the darkness of the woods became my only solace as they faded into the background, leaving me to navigate the twisted path of life alone. I never thought a simple issue like punctuality could unravel my life in such a terrifying way, but here I am, staring blankly at my phone, the glint of the screen reflecting my dread as I anticipate their all-too-familiar late arrival. My in-laws, the Johnsons, have turned tardiness into an art form. You see, it's not just the usual 15 minutes late, but often an hour, 2 hours, or sometimes not at all. Yes, they've pulled that stunt too, leaving me waiting in the restaurant, awkwardly pretending to enjoy a glass of wine while I wonder if they've been kidnapped by aliens or simply decided they'd rather binge-watch Friends than honor my dinner invitation. It's been years of this, and I've reached my breaking point. After yet another instance of me pacing the restaurant like a caged animal, I snapped and texted them a harsh message before this latest dinner with my wife's family: "If you can't make it on time, don't come at all." When they finally arrived, nearly an hour late, my father-in-law's face twisted in confusion, while my mother-in-law tutted softly, like a schoolteacher reprimanding a particularly dull student. But I didn't back down when they stormed out, leaving the restaurant empty and echoing our abandoned table. The rest of the evening was a tense silence at home, the air thick with my wife's disappointment, which turned to anger after she received a text from her mother, suggesting her husband was a monster who couldn't handle a few minor inconveniences. That night, I lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of my wife on her phone, her whispered arguments and the occasional near sob causing shadows to loom taller in our bedroom, until, at last, she turned toward me and refused to speak, her back a cold wall of resentment. Days went by after this explosive dinner, leaving me isolated and uncertain, with strings of tension that felt heavier than the very air I breathed, filling our home with an oppressive silence that buzzed around me. I started noticing things. Maybe my nerves were getting to me, but every time I walked past my in-laws' house, the curtains would twitch just a little too much, and I could swear I saw shadows that felt out of place, as if someone was always watching, waiting for a moment to pounce. My phone lit up late one night, a photo from my mother-in-law. The image showed my unseen daughter, barely 3 years old, standing at the window with that innocent, quizzical gaze, while the backyard glowed with an unsettling, almost unnatural light. I felt my insides twist when I noticed the reflection in the window behind her. It was my mother-in-law, but there was something wrong in her eyes, something wild, a glint that sent ice running through my veins, though I brushed it off as paranoia, convinced I was simply spiraling due to the stress of family tensions. But things only escalated. I began finding notes on my car, slipped under the windshield wipers that only read, "Time is slipping away," with no signature. Just a trembling anxiety creeping further into my soul. I told my wife about it, although I regretted the moment I saw the doubt construct a fortress around her disbelief, and she suggested I was overstressed, living in a fog of paranoia, but I knew better. Something was horribly wrong, and it seemed to mirror the late arrivals of my in-laws. One rainy evening as I returned from work, I noticed them standing in their driveway, drenched, appearing almost ghostly in the dim light, and when they finally approached, they had that same eerie look. They claimed to have just arrived back from a trip, yet this wasn't a regular visit. My skin prickled with dread as I processed that the clothes they wore didn't match weather conditions, nor did they carry any luggage. They insisted on spending time with my daughter, and despite my instincts screaming at me to protect her, my wife played along, and I could only hang back, unease coiling like a serpent in my gut as they led her into the dark house, a cavernous maw waiting to swallow innocent laughter. Things went completely dark when my daughter didn't return for hours, and I rushed around, pacing, calling her name before I banged down my in-laws' door, only to find them sitting there, hazy, eyes shimmering as they told me they were just having fun. Yet my little girl's absence felt like an eternity, and each second stretched into endless possibilities, a knot twisted unyieldingly at my core. Panic welled inside me, erupting into visceral desperation as I tore through their house, the fading scent of something metallic pulling me further into the nightmare unfolding within each stagnant room as I began seeing bizarre photographs plastered on the walls, pictures of children playing but with disturbing overtones of something nefarious, like their laughter was forcibly infused into each snapshot, faces twisted into grotesque smiles that made my skin crawl. I finally found my daughter, sitting eerily still in a dim-lit kitchen, her eyes glazed over, staring blankly into space, as if something had siphoned the brightness from her soul. When I reached for her, a voice, low and viscous, crawled through the air, laced with ethereal confidence that suggested they had been waiting for me all along. "You have to let her stay, she's ours now." With a primal scream, I ripped my daughter from the table, sprinting out of the house while a collective whisper cascaded behind me, sharpness in the air, promising I had only buried the truth of their generational curse deeper beneath a facade of civility. I bolted down the street, holding my child tightly as the relentless echoes of their laughter melded into a cacophony of threat behind me. Now, every time I hear the doorbell ring or see their silhouettes hovering in the corner of my eye, I am reminded that I can't escape the haunting truth. It's all interconnected, the waiting, the late arrivals, the suffocating silence betraying a sinister undercurrent that knows our fears and plays with them like a puppet master, realizing now that my choice to demand punctuality had awakened something within them that shouldn't have been stirred, and perhaps I sealed our fate when I thought I was just standing my ground. I'm not one to air my dirty laundry in public, but this has started to feel like a living nightmare, and I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. It began a few months ago when my husband, Greg, started bringing home a collection of vintage radios he found at estate sales. I thought it was a quirky yet harmless hobby, but soon his obsession took a twisted turn. He'd spend hours tinkering away in our dimly lit basement, meticulously restoring each radio, which at first felt endearing, but later it morphed into something more sinister. It was the way he talked to them, like they were old friends or confidants. He'd sit cross-legged on the floor, fiddling with the dials, murmuring, "It's all right, buddy, we'll get you fixed up soon," and I couldn't shake off the chill running down my spine each time I heard him. It drove me mad with worry, yet I brushed it off as one of those midlife crises that men seem to have. Then one night, after another exhausting day at work, I just snapped. I stood at the foot of the basement stairs, shivering as I listened to another muffled, almost pleading voice emanating from the radios, distorted but strangely urgent. Suddenly, a cacophony of static interrupted the night, and the voice seemed to weave through the cracks, promising unseen things like events to come or secrets better left unearthed. My heart raced, and I screamed down the stairs, "Shut up, Greg." It echoed in the walls, reaching an unnatural pitch as an unsettling silence fell over the room. I just wanted it to end, his nights of obsessive tinkering that pulled him deeper into madness while I stood helpless, watching him slip away, one radio at a time. He appeared moments later, confusion painted on his face, and I saw the way he almost flinched at my outburst. I panicked, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. "It's not me," he insisted, his voice trembled, emotion heavy in the silence. But it couldn't have been anything else. I noticed a new radio near the stairs, an old RCA model with the eeriest of designs, weathered and tarnished, as if it had been pulled from a grave. "You have to stop this," I begged, my voice cracking, tears blurring my sight as shadows flickered in the corner of my vision. He turned away, mumbling something I couldn't decipher, racing back into the basement as the static returned, washing over me like a haunting wave. Almost nightly, Greg would descend into that basement filled with technological nightmares, each repair entrenching him deeper in a cycle, while I lay awake, haunted by the murmurings of voices that twisted through the floors like an underground river of secrets. The static grew louder, more persistent, rising in unison with my anxiety until insomnia claimed its throne. My husband, so consumed by whatever he was chasing, became a ghost in our home. I missed the small gestures, his laughter, and the warmth we'd once shared. "You'll regret it," a voice floated from the radio one evening, its tone chilling, as if it were mocking my desperate pleas to save my husband and reclaim the life we once had. I decided I couldn't let it spiral any further. I rummaged through the basement one evening, ready to confront whatever was festering in the dark when I felt the radios watching me. More than just machines, they were menacing, malevolent eyes that drew me into their magnetic hold. That night, I pulled one from its place beneath Greg's clutter and brought it back upstairs, flinging it onto the kitchen table. "You want to talk?" I shouted, edging closer as I flipped the switch on. A jarring screech filled the air, and I immediately regretted the choice. I could have sworn I felt a chill grip my heart as I crouched near it. Rather than finding the static, I heard a voice clearer than before, yet it was Greg's, wrapped in layers of regret and something darker. "I told you not to listen." My stomach sank, pulling me deeper into a black pit of fear as I realized this was not just a radio, it was a vessel, a conduit for something that had crept into our lives, turning my husband into a hollow shell consumed by static and whispers of things I couldn't understand. "Make it stop," I pleaded, desperation clawing at my throat as the voice twisted my thoughts around like vines choking the life from a tree. The radio crackled. "You should have listened." I dropped it, my heart pounding like a war drum, the echoes haunting my mind, and in that instant, Greg stood behind me, his eyes wild, unfocused as if he were looking through me rather than at me. I took a step back, fear radiating from my every sense, and mumbled an apology, but all he did was shake his head slowly, a sorrowful expression creeping across his features. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking as he reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed against the vintage radio, almost as if trying to beg it for forgiveness. "It won't end until I'm finished." Something in me snapped anew as I knew I had to take a stand. So much of him was trapped down there, I could feel it like a frayed string of yarn unraveling into madness, and before he could fully comprehend, I grabbed the radio, my heart racing, smashing it against the floor with a sickening crack, the voice wailing as pieces exploded. In an instant, his expression morphed into a sharp, raging understanding, like a fuse had been lit. "What have you done?" Silence fell like a heavy blanket as I held my breath, terrified I'd unleashed some unknown horror. When he lunged at me, it surprised even myself. I flung myself backward, landing against the countertop, my heart racing like a runaway train. "You're not yourself," I shouted back at him, my own panic-laden voice filled with the raw edge of fear. And suddenly, it became apparent, this wasn't just a hobby gone awry, it was something greater, clawing into every crevice of our lives, testing our trust, our love, and I realized that letting it consume us would mean losing everything I held dear. The basement rattled, a deep rumble emanating from below, as if the radios were screaming all at once, unseen cries of the damned that echoed through our home. I felt fragile from the weight it threatened to crush me with, and as I faced my husband, seeing the shadows of the old radio flickering behind him, despair washed over me. But it wasn't just despair, it was a promise, a whisper caressing my ear, warning me of the dark abyss waiting to swallow us whole if I didn't fight with everything I had left. "We can fix this," I shouted, emotions surging like tidal waves, "but you need to see the truth." His expression shifted, and for a moment, the shadows behind him seemed to relent, flickering like fading embers, as if my words echoed just enough to ignite a flicker of clarity deep within him. With each heartbeat, I felt the bond trying to mend, the air charged with the remnants of names unspoken and hopes tethered to unseen forces. "Please." I barely managed to breathe, tears flooding my vision. "I don't want to lose you." And just like that, something sparked in those hollow eyes. For a split second, I saw my husband emerge from the depths of shadows, an insistent flicker of warmth breaking through the cold facade. But then the shadows behind Greg twisted malevolently, deep laughter, sly and insistent, trickled out, reminding me of how close he had come to losing himself entirely. The moment shattered as I felt chilling breaths emanating from the ruins of the shattered radio, its remnants still alive with echoes of things unnamed. I stormed out, but as I reached the front door, turning back nervously, my heart sank. His silhouette was gone, and in its place was an impenetrable dark, with static rising hauntingly in the air. "Shut up!" I screamed into the void, a raw shout of defiance against the encroaching darkness. In the eerie stillness that followed, I genuinely wondered if I would ever get my husband back, or if he was now nothing more than a note in a forgotten song, static lost to the frequencies of madness. And now, as I type this, I keep glancing at that basement door, terrified that one day I might hear his voice calling, urging me to join him in the void, asking if I would finally understand what it meant to listen. Or if in that moment, I'd finally lose my last chance to save him from the creeping horrors that whispered in the night. I never thought that a simple no could spiral my life into a relentless nightmare, but then again, I think we often underestimate how quickly the human mind can twist itself into the shape of malice. It all started when my neighbor, who I had always considered friendly, knocked on my door one chilly autumn afternoon. He was desperate, explaining that he had family visiting and no parking space available, pleading for just one day's use of my extra spot, something I had meticulously preserved since my brother had passed. I felt guilty, even as I formed my words, recalling that it wasn't my responsibility to accommodate him. "I'm sorry, but I really need that spot," I said firmly. He blinked, disappointment flashing across his face, and for a split second, I worried I had crossed some invisible line. "Okay, suit yourself," he replied, his voice slipping into that unsettling calmness that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. That evening, I settled into my usual routine, but the air in my apartment felt thick and stifling, as if the walls themselves were eavesdropping. The next day, I noticed my neighbor's car parked in front of my driveway, blocking my entrance. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but now it felt like a direct challenge. I stepped outside, greeted by a swollen sense of dread. "Could you move your car?" I called out, forcing a smile that felt feeble. His response sent chills racing along my spine. "Not my fault your spot is empty, is it?" From then on, it felt like a war, each day adding fuel to the fires of resentment. He called in false complaints about my late-night music, Neighborhood Watch was informed that I had too many guests parked out front, and it wasn't long before I realized he made it clear to others that I was a nightmare neighbor. The whispers slithered through the streets like an unwelcome fog, suffocating every connection I'd formed in the block. Isolation wrapped around me, a warm but suffocating blanket. I went to my car one moonlit evening only to find it scratched, deep gashes carved across the pristine paint. I stood there, heart racing, and it hit me that this was no coincidence. When I confronted him, he merely laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that haunted me even in my dreams. It wasn't long before every friendly face in the neighborhood turned away, lost somewhere in the disarray of rumors and twisted truths. I decided to take a different route and began documenting everything, each incident meticulously noted in a notebook, the complaints, the damage, the ominous notes slipped under my door. It felt sensible at first, like a lifeline thrown into a pool of chaos, but as the pages turned, the act felt increasingly paranoid and desperate. One night, racked with anxiety, I curled up on my couch with a few glasses of wine, hoping the alcohol would dull the sharp edges of fear. While grappling with insomnia, I decided to check my doorbell camera, both for shreds of sanity and evidence. I just wanted to run through the footage of the night I had scratched paint. To my horror, I discovered something I could never have anticipated: my neighbor standing outside, wearing a thick black hoodie, his face obscured beneath the darkness of a winter night. He loomed by my car, pouring some clear liquid onto the trunk. It shimmered like a bright star when it caught the light. I panicked, realizing I had forgotten to lock my door. Shoving past the beers and the remnants of junk food, defense mechanisms against the chilling apprehension now boiling my blood, I ran to the door, my heart pounding a thunderous rhythm. I flung it open, but he was gone, leaving behind an echo of laughter that felt like ice spilling through my veins. The next day, I filed a police report, but the officer, a weary middle-aged man with coffee stains on his uniform, seemed more amused than concerned. "Just a neighbor dispute, ma'am, nothing serious," he chuckled, dismissing my escalating paranoia while I insisted through gritted teeth that his actions had crossed an unsafe line. Days turned into weeks, but the situation escalated. One morning, I woke to find my entire car was covered in eggs, some smashed and gunky, the others still intact like rotten grenades. I could no longer discern the difference between reality and a waking nightmare. Was it even possible for someone to be that vindictive? A dark reflection of my own thoughts bubbled up, suggesting maybe this monsoon of chaos wouldn't end until I retaliated, until I dove as deep into this nightmarish rabbit hole as he had. But just as I found a tiny ember of resolve within, unease cloaked me as I spied him staring at me one lonely afternoon, a wide grin plastered across his face. It twisted something inside me. Perhaps this was all a game to him. I sought answers, diving into deeper roots. I tracked whispers of past neighbors who had endured their own terror at his hands, piecing together a fractured narrative that revealed a history soaked in acrimony. Each encounter morphed into dread, the shadows thickening with lies. The sense of friendship had crystallized into something sinister. My final attempt to reclaim my space felt extravagant, even foolish. I tossed out everything I had documented and staged a confrontation I knew bordered on insanity. The night felt thick with foreboding as I cornered him outside, demanding he leave me alone, but he merely laughed again, that infuriating, deep sound that wrapped around my consciousness like a vice. "Why don't you focus on managing your own space instead of wasting time at my door?" His words rolled over me like a cold wave. In that moment, I recognized the absurdity of trying to fight someone so twisted, so bent. I stepped back, something inside me fracturing as I muttered, "You'll regret this," my voice small, an echo of fading confidence. And just as I turned to leave, I heard what felt like the closing act of a narrative gone awry, my heart halting when he called out to me one last time, "You already have." I drove that evening, not to work or friends, but to the edge of sanity, piecing together the tangled web of fear and loathing that had bared itself in my life. It took time, but in those shockingly still moments, clarity descended upon me. I understood my only option to end this sick game was to move away permanently, to cleanse myself of the taint of his shadowy presence. As I packed, every belonging stripped away from the condo felt like an entanglement burnt from me. I left that apartment a shell of who I was, yet had it ever truly been mine? I shrugged off the weight of his existence like a snake distilling its skin. But as I drove toward the next chapter in my life, with a bittersweet taste, I vowed to never forget the lesson learned. In neighborhoods where darkness breeds, kindness is a fickle facade, and sometimes refusing to let others in comes with a heavy price. AITA for refusing to go to my Mills for dinner anymore. Most days, I feel guilty about it, but after the last experience, there's no way I can ever set foot in her house again. It started innocently enough. My husband and I had been married for a few years, and his mother insisted on hosting a weekly Sunday dinner. I used to enjoy those meals, filled with laughter and stories, but after the first incident, enjoyment shifted to dread. The first time it happened, we arrived to find the table lavishly set, but a deep chill permeated the air, something off, like stepping into a mausoleum. I brushed it off, chalked it up to an odd draft or maybe too many candles, but I swear it felt like we were being watched. As dinner began, my husband's mother started talking about her collection. Instead of dishes or porcelain cats, she was referring to disturbing shadows moving in the corners of her home, whispers that crept through the walls. You must listen closely, she said, her voice dropping an octave as her eyes flickered to the corners. They have stories to tell. I laughed nervously, hoping it was all a joke, but she was dead serious, her gaze drowning in something dark, almost tangible, and I shared an uneasy glance with my husband. I could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. Dinner continued, each course more unsettling than the last, her smile curving like a crescent moon, and I found myself staring at the chicken, the skin too pale, almost sickly. The way it glistened under the light turned my stomach. As the evening wore on, I could feel a sinister presence lingering just outside the reach of my peripheral vision. After the meal, she insisted we look at her newest acquisition, leading us to a small, dusty room at the back of the house. Inside was a large mirror, its surface warped, the kind you see in horror movies. The reflections never quite match reality. My heart raced as she began to explain. She claimed the mirror reflected not just our images, but souls, capturing the essence of those within its grasp. My husband awkwardly laughed it off, but my skin prickled with unease. Then came the fateful moment. She said we should gather together before the mirror for a family picture, claiming it can bond us forever. My husband jokingly pushed his shoulders back, confidence evidently faltering as I hesitated, the air thickening, a weight pressing down on my chest as I moved closer. As the camera clicked, I felt something shift behind me. I turned and caught a flicker of movement, something dark and serpentine writhing against the wall. I gasped, but when I looked again, it was gone, dissolved into the shadows where the light didn't quite reach. I thought maybe I was just imagining it, but I could sense something watching. We hurried out after that, but not without an overwhelming guilt for my sudden sense of dread. When we visited the following week, I could feel the strange tension ballooning. The air at the dinner table felt tight, like a noose, everything a stifling echo of the past. My mother-in-law, ever so perceptive, picked up on my discomfort. "Do you see them?" she whispered during dessert, her eyes glinting with a strange fervor. For a moment, panic clawed at my throat. I didn't want to admit to any unseen horrors. "See? What?" I responded with a trembling voice, and she only smiled wider, revealing far too many teeth. That night, I couldn't shake an icy grip wrapping around my spine. I had horrific nightmares of dark figures closing in, whispering my name, clawing at the edges of my sanity. It felt so real, and when I woke up, heart racing, drenched in sweat, I resolved to tell my husband I couldn't go back. He took it poorly, surprised by my sudden shift, but I urged him to listen. I knew something was very wrong, but he just laughed it off, chalking it up to an overstimulating imagination. The following week, I decided to confront her. "I don't want to come to dinner anymore," I stated flatly. Her face contorted, suddenly aging before my eyes, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. "But the others? The family needs you," she hissed, and at that moment, her eyes darkened until they were like two voids, and I remembered every ghostly whisper she had let linger in the air. I racked my brain to think of an excuse, any reason to get out of it, but the second I did, she gripped my wrist with a surprising ferocity, and I felt a jolt of sickness clawing my insides. "You're one of us now, you belong to the collection," her voice was low, rumbling from deep within her. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my hand free. I told my husband I couldn't do this any longer, that I couldn't bear to be part of an acquisition or collection, that I needed peace away from those dreadful dinners. It was easier said than done. Eventually, he accepted my request, albeit begrudgingly. But every now and then, he would ask me why I was being unreasonable, why I couldn't just come back for one dinner. My resolve was tested again when weeks passed, and I started to sense a strange displacement at home, an emptiness settling over our lives. My husband habitually mentioned how much his mother missed me, and with time, I could see shadows again, thicker than before, creeping along the walls at night, creeping into my dreams. My sleep was invaded by visions of dark reflections whispering my name, twisting and warping into shapes I couldn't comprehend. I began hearing muffled words drifting through the air, begging me to return, to join them, but I fought against it, focusing on the love that had once surrounded us. That's when I found the pictures. I was looking through an old family album when I stumbled upon our last photo taken before the mirror. My heart dropped as I studied the photograph. My husband was smiling, but behind him, I could see it, an inky shadow, clawing and stretching out of the periphery, its eyes glinting with malicious intent. I showed the picture to my husband, but he only shook his head, unable to see what I saw through the darkness. Despair clawed at me. How could I return to that dinner table and face those malicious whispers again? That night, I laid awake, trying to rationalize it all when I heard it. Whispering, insistent, calling for me. They were back, the dark figures pressing in closer until I couldn't breathe. In my desperation to escape, I ran to our bedroom mirror, and there, in the reflection, was my mother-in-law, her face twisted in that ghastly smile, a prism of shadows coiling around her as she spoke. "You belong to the collection, sweet girl," she hissed, and with every sip of breath, the shadows deepened, encroaching not just in the mirror reflection but swallowing me into a maelstrom of darkness. I cried out, tore myself away from the mirror, icy fingers chasing me, chasing the hollow pit in my stomach. I made the worst decision ever. I called my husband to come see it. He needed to understand. But when he hurried to my side, she was gone, the mirror only reflecting my panic-stricken face. The whispers intensified, and I gasped as the reflections began to shape into the forms of those I didn't recognize, past family dinners replaying shadows of forgotten loves, lost souls trapped in that grim essence. As I bolted out of the mirror's gaze, dread enveloped me, and a horrifying truth surged as I grasped the reality. That mirror was a trap, an ancient device luring me into her collection, binding me with the dark remnants of her family that would never let me go. I knew, without a single doubt, returning meant becoming part of that burgeoning collection forever, and that's when I finally understood, AITA for refusing to go to my mills for dinner anymore. No, I was simply fighting to keep my soul intact. Ever since my parents divorced, family gatherings had started morphing into tense affairs, but nothing could have prepared me for the fallout when my dad's ex, Marla, showed up unexpectedly one rainy evening, drenched and disheveled, claiming she'd been evicted. As the thunder rumbled outside, I could feel the weight of her presence in our living room, a far cry from the woman I remembered, her usual vibrant laugh now reduced to a shaky whisper as she recounted her misfortunes to my dad, leaning heavily on the coffee table as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. I hung back in the hallway, my heart pounding. My instincts screamed that her flimsy excuses masked something darker, but my dad's sympathetic nods only fueled my unease. I knew how her charm could woo even the most skeptical, and as they discussed her dire situation, I felt something in the pit of my stomach twist. I'd heard the stories of her reckless behavior, her penchant for manipulation, and how she had once left my dad stranded in a sleazy motel with nothing but a change of clothes. My dad was generous to a fault, the kind of man who would give his last dime to someone in need, and while I admired his compassion, I worried he would fall prey to her act once again. I finally decided I couldn't remain a spectator. I stepped into the living room, my palms sweaty and my heart racing as I interrupted their conversation, my voice steadier than I felt. "Dad, we can't let her stay here." The room fell silent. Marla's eyes narrowed, simmering with an anger I had never seen directed toward me before. She quickly masked it with a feigned pout, and my dad's face twisted with confusion. "What do you mean?" "She needs help." I pressed on, my resolve hardening as I recounted her past, how she dragged him through the mud time and time again. "She's not just going to use us as a safety net to escape her own choices." Instead of the agreement I had anticipated, my dad waved my words away, his disappointment cutting deeper than my rejection of Marla seemed to sting her. In a dramatic turn, she dropped her head, feigning tears, and I saw the game in the way her lower lip trembled. "Are you really going to let her down?" My conscience screamed as she pointedly glanced at the spare room door. I fought back the urge to argue as the storm outside intensified, matching the tortured silence in the house. It felt as if lightning would split open the very roof above us. "I just need a week. Just until I get back on my feet," she pleaded, but I knew from experience that 1 week could turn into 1 month and then 1 year. The atmosphere thickened with tension. I could feel my dad wavering, torn between compassion and the realization that I was right, and it made my heart ache. "I'm sorry, but I still think she should leave," I said quietly, desperate to end this stalemate. Marla pressed her lips together, rage igniting behind her eyes as if I had personally insulted her. My dad's expression turned unreadable, a mixture of disappointment and frustration swirling like the storm outside. The minute tension bubbled over when she stood up suddenly, rage burning like cold fire in her eyes as she spat out, "You're going to regret this, kid." I took a step back, the hairs on my neck standing on end, and as she stormed out of the room, I felt an unsettling chill creep in, an inclination that I had just summarized a series of escalating consequences. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marla would not simply let this go. The rain pattered on the roof gently, an eerie lullaby, but her parting words echoed violently through my mind. I tried to convince myself I had done the right thing, but deep down, a whisper niggled at me. Was I wrong to protect my space? The dread followed me into sleep, laced in vivid nightmares of lightning flashes illuminating her figure lurking outside, watching, waiting, as if planning her next move. Days turned into weeks, and the unease settled around our house like an unwelcome fog. The rain had stopped, but every time I stepped outside, the air had that charged quality, a sense of impending doom clinging to me. My fears were validated when strange things began to happen. First, it was the missing items, my favorite jacket, a set of headphones, even my car keys disappeared from plain sight. I dismissed it as misplacing them until I found a single deliberate note tucked beneath my pillow, written in a chaotic scrawl that sent shivers down my spine: "Freedom isn't free." Panic began swelling in me as every day someone knocked on our door, or my phone buzzed with an unknown number only to drop to silence as I answered, the static echoing heavily in the air. My dad tried brushing off my concerns, attributing everything to paranoia, his belief in second chances overshadowing my growing dread. I could feel him slipping further from me, and Marla was utilizing that as her tool. It wasn't until one evening, out of nowhere, I found my dad pacing the living room, his expression lost and strained as he cradled the numerous eviction notices piling up on the table. When I strayed closer, glancing at the papers and unable to comprehend why they would impact us, he looked at me helplessly. "She said she would help us." The final thread stretched to a breaking point. I felt the world around me collapse as gravity lost its grip. It wasn't Marla invading our home that terrified me, it was this silent truth that had woven its way into our lives like poison. I raced to my phone, dialing my dad's number with shaking hands, my own heart racing with desperation. I could hear my heart thudding against the walls of my chest like a war drum, and just then, my heart sank when I saw the screen light up minutes later with a familiar unknown number. I hesitated, every gut instinct screaming at me not to answer, but curiosity won. As I lifted the phone to my ear, that same chaotic laughter echoed through the receiver, cruel and mocking. "Didn't I tell you you'd regret it, kid?" It dawned on me, horrifyingly, just how much I had underestimated her. The line crackled with her malevolent glee, and a chill coursed through me like ice. Yet I found my voice. "What do you want?" She responded slowly, each word dripped in venom. "You owe me for all I did for your father. I'll be a part of your life whether you like it or not." I nearly dropped the phone, mouth dry as panic surged, a thousand terrible possibilities racing through my mind. That night I barricaded my bedroom door, adrenaline pumping as paranoia took hold. Each creak of the house felt sinister, it lingered like a sentient creature, watching for a moment of vulnerability. I knew she was out there, somewhere in the haze, waiting for the perfect moment to make her next move, and with that, I had everything I had wanted to regain balance slip through my fingers. I never thought that allowing my mother to host Thanksgiving dinner at my house would lead to such chaos, but here we are, 3 days away from the holiday, and all I can think about is how I may have opened the door to something unspeakable. My wife, Sarah, is heavily pregnant with our 4th child and has been feeling exhausted and anxious, so I thought it would be a kind gesture to let my mother take over the cooking this year. She's been insisting on bringing her classic turkey and stuffing for as long as I can remember, and although my mother is eccentric, let's just say her ideas about food are unique, she promised she wouldn't do anything too outlandish this time. Since our first Thanksgiving together as a married couple, I've always felt the pressure of blending our families in the presence of holiday cheer, and Sarah has been under so much stress already. But as the day approaches, I've started to notice things that make my skin crawl. It began when my mother presented a package of what she claimed were secret spices for the turkey, each ingredient labeled with cryptic names. She explained they were traditional family recipes passed down for generations, but there was something eerie about the way her eyes sparkled when she mentioned them, like a wolf revealing its meal after a successful hunt. Sarah, noticing my discomfort, told me to ease up and let my mom have her fun, but late at night, when it was just the 3 of us and the kids were asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I could hear my mother moving around the kitchen, testing her concoctions and humming strange lullabies that felt foreign, even menacing, in their melody. The scent of the spices wafting into the living room was strangely intoxicating, laced with an undertone that made me feel both dizzy and anxious, and every time I tried to confront her, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand, claiming it was all in good spirit and for the family. It was around this same time that I found our youngest, Emma, talking to what she described as an invisible friend who made her giggle loudly at odd moments. Kids her age often have imaginary friends, but when I pried deeper, Emma's stories took on a bizarre, unsettling tone. He says Grandma's food is magic and that we're all invited to dinner, she'd say, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation, as if she were caught between a dream and a nightmare. As Thanksgiving Day neared, my anxiety spiraled, and it didn't help that Sarah was increasingly sleepy and withdrawn, unable to shake what she described as a lingering fog in her mind. It was then that I went to look for my mother, only to find her hunched over the kitchen table, her fingers dripping with purple-red juices that I didn't want to think too hard about. "I'm just preparing the turkey, sweetie, don't worry," she said with an unsettling grin that stretched across her face, revealing crooked teeth that seemed to glisten with something unholy. I saw a glimpse of the turkey. Its skin was unnaturally glossy, and there were an array of small, round wounds where the feathers had once lain, looking almost like a string of pearls encased in the fleshy, glistening skin. "Where did you get this?" I uttered, trying to keep my throat from constricting too tightly. My mother looked back at me, her expression shifting from affectionate to something feral, and though she didn't answer, the air in the room thickened with a kind of infectious dread. I stumbled backward, grappling with the chill creeping up my spine, convinced my mother was losing her mind. Before I could leave, she whispered, "They'll love it, they were waiting for you," and my heart raced painfully at the insinuation. It was without question a breaking point. I confronted Sarah, suggesting we uninvite my mother, but her response left me stunned. "Let her do this, please. I think I need it. I don't want to deal with anything else right now." I pestered her for weeks, but with that hint of desperation in her voice, I felt backed into a corner. Thanksgiving came, and the atmosphere was rife with tension. I attempted to remain composed as friends and family arrived, but a discomforting strain hung over us, a dark cloud shrouding the festivities. The food, glistening in all its macabre beauty, began to arrive, turkey adorned with crimson glimmers, sides overflowing with vibrant colors, the very air filled with an intoxicating sweetness that made my head spin. As we sat at the table, I eyed the kids, who eagerly hovered over the food, whispering secrets amongst one another, fueled by some silent pact I couldn't grasp. I watched in horror as they took their first bites, followed by delightful gasps and soft giggles, every forkful seeming to ignite their spirits to heights I'd never seen before, yet there was an edge of something primal in their delight. The adults, too, were transfixed, chatting joyfully as if no one else could sense the creeping chill between us, the hallucinations in the corners of visions that twisted laughter into darker sounds. My chest tightened as I felt my mother's gnarled fingers brush against my shoulder, and she leaned in to whisper, "They told me this day would come, that all would be well. Don't you see, this is how we keep the magic alive?" I felt ice coil around my heart, the ominous weight of her words settling deep within me. The moment Emma leaned across the table, her smile too wide, too predatory, to announce that Grandma's magic tastes so good. And my body began to betray me, the urge to scream battling against my instinct to protect. And then, just as quickly, I felt my resolve waver, almost collapsing under the deliciously dark enchantment that twisted through the air like invisible threads binding us all. That evening blurred between reality and terror, all of us trapped in a dreamscape where joy danced alongside malevolence. I realized with a jolt that the children were not simply enjoying a Thanksgiving feast, something dangerous was unfolding. Before I could act, the lights flickered, plunging us into shadows, and as confusion reigned, Sarah's voice echoed through the darkness, "We're all just pieces in her game," tinged with an eerie, knowing calmness, as if she were in on a secret knowing I could not comprehend. At that moment, I felt an exhilarating thrill of the macabre awakening deep inside, tearing at the ties of sanity as I become a spectator in this grotesque festival, watching my family become enraptured, my mother's soft laughter raking through the cracks of normality, as they surrendered to a feast that was anything but ordinary. I could hear a soft chant rise from the children, their words swirling like whispers carried on the wind, and that night, as darkness settled, I understood that I had failed my family. What I had thought to be a simple holiday dinner had turned into a horrifying rite, where every bite tightened the grip of something lurking, hungry, at the edges of my world, drawn in by a maternal force that would stop at nothing to ensure that this Thanksgiving would never end. When my husband, Josh, died unexpectedly, a part of me shattered, twisting grief and disbelief into a bitter knot that settled heavy in my chest. We had only been married 5 years, but they had been the happiest years of my life. Josh was everything, my best friend, my partner, and the light in my life. Losing him felt like a slow suffocation, a waking nightmare that consumed me as I navigated funeral arrangements and the aftermath of his sudden passing. His mother, Elaine, had always been a complicated figure in our lives. She was supportive yet overbearing, and although Josh struggled with their relationship, I tried to foster peace between them. But after he was gone, that dynamic morphed into something else entirely. When I received the life insurance payout, a staggering six-figure sum, Elaine immediately insisted that she needed half to cover the funeral costs she'd put on her credit card. I was taken aback. There was no discussion of her covering it or me paying her back later, just a demand as if her procession of grief gave her authority over my choices. I had expected tears, shared memories, and perhaps even a quiet moment where we could both remember Josh, but instead, a dark shadow hung over her eyes while she openly calculated her financial expectations. I remember being at the funeral, standing by his casket, the cool air heavy with an unspoken tension. Elaine had taken charge, orchestrating the details as if it were her final say in a business transaction rather than a memorial, and I can't help but wonder if this was her way of grasping control in a world spiraling out of our hands. With every interaction, her disappointment in me deepened. I wasn't mourning in the way she'd expected, perhaps because, beneath my sorrow, I felt the stirrings of anger that soon flared into resentment. When she demanded I give her money, something in me snapped. "It's not your money to demand, Elaine," I hissed, the words spilling out encased in bitterness. Her face turned ash white, an expression that danced between disbelief and outrage. I thought about the moments I shared with Josh, the joy we built together, and the memories we created as a couple. It felt wrong to surrender that to her. I finally decided to pay for the memorial and cover the remaining costs with the life insurance money, my own damn money, from a plan we had for our future, when I was now simply trying to navigate without him, in a world that felt cold and hollow. I figured it was my right to choose how to honor him, to be the one who decides where that money went, but that wasn't how Elaine saw it. Over the following weeks, she became more persuasive in her demands, trying to warp my sense of obligation by draping her words in grief. "You don't want to forget Josh, do you? You want to honor him," she would say, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like a threat than kindness. I felt like I was being cornered in an emotional chess game, the pieces tipped in her favor. I watched her weave conversations filled with guilt while describing how hard it was raising Josh alone as a single parent, as if this somehow implied I owed her tribute for his very existence. I couldn't shake the feeling that her grief was more about her than about Joshua as I desperately sought the support of friends and family. Most didn't take my side, they echoed Elaine's logic, making me feel like a villain for wanting to claim what was rightfully mine, especially when they'd hear her sob stories. The nights that followed were filled with anxiety, guilt gnawing under my skin while I replayed those unbearable conversations. I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own house, constantly haunted by my inability to bend to her will. One evening, as I was sorting through Josh's things, a muted ping from my phone snatched my attention. It was Elaine, with a photo of the blurred headstone at the cemetery, eerily illuminated by a waxing moon. Beneath it, she wrote, "This is where my only son sleeps, and you're the reason I have to suffer alone." I could feel the walls closing in around me, the pressure rising as I tried to breathe through waves of panic and regret. Who's the real monster here? I thought, and countered my discomfort with a cold resentment. In that moment of blind rage, I decided to take a step farther. If she wanted to make this a game of emotional leverage, I would turn the tables. A few days later, as I watched her elaborate on her grief during family dinners to anyone who would listen, I gathered strength. I made plans to take a trip. I turned the life insurance into an opportunity. I booked a getaway to the mountains where Josh and I had always dreamed of spending a weekend, without a care in the world. It was a sanctuary for healing, and I was desperately clinging to memories of the man I loved. My phone buzzed frantically days before I was supposed to leave. It was Elaine, demanding to know where I was going. "It's none of your business," I retorted. Instead of caving under her barrage of guilt-laden messages, I dug deeper into my anger. I left, erasing the emotional strings Elaine had hoped to bind me with. The mountains embraced me like a lover, and there I found solace. I spent time reflecting on who Josh was, what he wanted, and how much he had fought to keep a distance from his chaotic family dynamics. A week passed in blissful isolation before I returned home to a barrage of voicemail and texts detailing accusations of theft, betrayal, and loss of family. I moved through my own fog of despair, waking nightmares that swirled in my mind as I listened. That's when it hit me. I was at the center of this conflict, one that would not fade away. It culminated one last terrible afternoon when I received a summons in the mailbox addressed in her meticulous handwriting, her betrayal now turned legal. The walls I had hoped to reinforce around my grief began to shake as dread seeped into every corner of my heart. I never intended to stop her from grieving, and I never wanted the insurance money to be the focal point of a battle for something as precious as memory. But looking back now, I recognize that Elaine didn't just want money, she wanted control over the narrative of her son's life, even in death. I am left to contend with the guilt that wraps around me like a shroud, yet, somewhere deep within, I know Josh would want me to find my own peace, and perhaps there's more to life than the pain of losing someone, especially someone who had to be let go, regardless of the bones they left behind. As I share this, I wonder, AITA for wanting to keep the money that was my lifeline to a man whose life I cherished more than anything? Perhaps it doesn't matter, not anymore. What matters now is confronting the echoes of a love that once lit my way and deciding how best to carry that light forward, alone. I never thought a high school election could be the catalyst for so much chaos, but when I found myself losing the race for class president to Alex, a guy who was as popular as a sparkling social media influencer and twice as fake, something inside me snapped. Leading up to the election, I had poured my heart into my campaign, pouring countless hours into speeches and posters, all while trying to promote my vision of a more inclusive school, only to watch as Alex waltzed around, throwing lavish parties and posting perfectly staged selfies that made me feel like a ghost compared to his booming presence. On that fateful day, as the countdown to the announcement ticked down, I felt an undercurrent of dread snaking through my thoughts, an awareness that my passion for change stood no chance against shallow charm. When the principal finally declared Alex the winner, the sound of raucous applause and laughter felt like a dagger plunging into my chest, leaving me breathless with anger and humiliation. In a fit of rage, I stormed out of the auditorium, unable to contain my gnawing frustration, not just at losing but at the entire system that glorified mediocrity over genuine effort. I was tired of pretending it didn't matter, it did matter. Fueled by indignation, I hastily drafted a resignation letter on my phone, angrily posting it in our class group chat, bitterly declaring that there was no way someone like Alex could lead us. I thought my message might resonate, maybe even go viral around the school, but instead, it was met with a silence that felt heavier than the thundering applause I had just witnessed. The next day, however, my decision spiraled into something far more sinister. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but not of support. Instead, my peers turned on me, the whispers and snickers echoing down hallways like a haunting wind, leaving me isolated. I had unleashed something I couldn't contain, a dark curiosity started spreading. Who were these people I once called friends, who pretended loyalty while eagerly stoking the coals of someone else's success? I began to notice strange things around me, my locker mysteriously jammed with an array of sticky notes, taunting me with phrases like just a loser or a standing ovation for Alex. Every morning before first period, there was something new, something that felt eerily tailored just for me, an intelligent push of humiliation that seemed to stalk my every step. That's when I saw the first video, a poorly lit, grainy clip of a group of students huddled together near the library, whispering and pointing at me, hatching conspiracies about my sour grapes and my unpopularity. It made my skin crawl, the realization that I was being hunted, and not for sport, but for fun, twisted their laughter into something monstrous. I tried talking to a teacher, but the weight of my accusations fell flat. They simply encouraged me to turn the other cheek and think positively. But how could I? Those whispers chose me as their entertainment. I knew I couldn't let this go. I began obsessively scrolling through social media, seeking recognition of my turmoil, wondering if others felt it too. I stumbled upon an obscure forum, a shadowy place where school dramas festered and spilled into the digital abyss, a chaotic collection of stories that made mine seem mundane. But buried in that cacophony was a community that thrived on misfortune, a hive intent on exposing what they deemed hidden truths. It was the perfect storm, and I couldn't look away. As weeks turned into months, I became a reluctant participant in this new narrative unfolding, a corner of cyberspace that amplified the vindictive laughter I felt daily. I learned that Alex wasn't just skating by on privilege, he had secrets of his own, and in that forum, I was pushed by an anonymous figure toward the darkest corners of gossip. I started posting about my experiences, disguised through an anonymous handle, weaving a narrative that cast me as the unyielding hero fighting against the corruption. I expected support, but received something unexpected, a raw, visceral acknowledgement of pain. Those who saw my plight echoed it back to me, but the moment I dared to mention Alex's shadowy connections, the laughter morphed into something darker, urging me to dig deeper. Days turned into a fever dream, losing track of what was real and what was a manufactured facade. So, when I finally decided to take action, concocting elaborate schemes to expose Alex, plotting to record him making lewd remarks hidden behind the bathrooms, my sense of moral clarity was long gone. I knew I had crossed a line, but it was intoxicating, like a drug feeding a mania that pulsated through every fiber of my being. Now, even in the dead of night, I would scroll through my phone, glued to what was once my biggest fear, the threat of being unknown, the scorn of being invisible, all black and white images blurring into the chaotic storm that consumed me. Then came the night that everything crashed. In the depths of a swirling digital web, Alex's world collided with mine, and secrets fell like raindrops during a storm. During a party, I confronted him, armed with evidence of his misdeeds, but ended up cornered, outnumbered by his smug entourage. I was desperate, crying out about everything that had been done to me, about the lies and the clenched fists of the school's social hierarchy, but no one cared. They laughed at my anguish, drowning me in a cascade of ridiculing comments and shoves. The weight of humiliation twisted inside me, morphing into something more sinister, until I felt myself reach a breaking point. I don't know what happened next. Maybe adrenaline took over, or something darker that had been festering inside erupted like a volcano, but in that moment, I snapped. I lunged at Alex, screaming. The throng around us scattered, shocked, but it didn't matter. I felt unstoppable as I threw him against a wall, the sound of his head connecting with the metal locker echoing through the hallway, a warning clap to the mocking audience. As the chaos unfolded around me, blurred by my own rage, I thought about how everything had gotten so out of hand, how a simple school election had turned me from hopeful visionary to deranged antagonist in my own story. From that moment on, I realized I couldn't hide any more from the truth that had chased me simply because I had chosen to be vulnerable. There, in that moment of exposed honesty, I didn't care if it cost me everything. I was done being the side character in someone else's narrative. When I was 13, my family took me to visit my cousin Chloe, who lived in a small town where rumors wrapped around old houses like thick vines, and where the wind seemed to be a constant whisper of secrets. I adored Chloe. She was always the life of the party, brimming with laughter and confident chatter. But that summer night, everything changed when I ventured into the unfamiliar shadows of her house, seeking the solace of her bedroom, where old posters flaked on the walls and scented candles struggled against the oppressive humid air. Chloe's boyfriend, Tom, was there, and he wore an unsettling grin. "You should really see how easy it is to summon spirits," he said, a spark of something darker glittering in his eyes. I shrugged it off, trying to focus on the flickering candlelight, but his words festered, like a nest of wasps in my gut. Later that night, after he shoved a chair beneath the window and claimed to have called the dead by their first names, we gathered around the small table, Tom urging us to play a game, an innocent enough guise, but I could tell he was feeding off my unease. Chloe twirled her hair, oblivious to the dread crawling up my spine, but despite my protests, curiosity clawed at me until I felt I had no choice but to give in. As we joined hands in a circle, Tom began talking to the darkness, inviting any entity to join us, while a chill seeped into the room. A pressure hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as the candles flickered wildly and the temperature dropped. I shuddered, desperately wishing for a way out, when a flash of cold wind swept through the eerily still air, and the lights flickered, sending all three of us sprawling in panic against the wall. I thought I saw it, a shadow darting behind Tom, and I swear, for a brief moment, I could feel the breath of something unfathomable on my neck. "Stop it," I shouted, the pitch of my voice breaking. Chloe shot me a hurt look as Tom smirked, clearly reveling in my unease. I didn't like the way he looked at her, like she was nothing more than a pawn to be manipulated in his sick game. When I finally pulled away, running down the dimly lit hallway with pounding footsteps, I felt something cold and unyielding grip my heart, like the hand of whatever he had conjured. I stumbled out of the house, frantically kicking stones in the gravel driveway, determined to put distance between me and Tom's sinister antics. As I walked away, I lost track of time, my senses overwhelmed by the buzzing of cicadas and the distant murmur of wind slipping between the trees. I thought, foolishly, that I could shake the feeling of dread, but in the pit of my stomach, I felt I had made a mistake. By leaving, I had done something wrong. But suddenly, a loud crash echoed behind me, and I turned to see the front door swing open, Chloe stumbling out, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you leave?" she wailed, her breath hitching. I could barely form a response, the morbid reality sinking in. Before I could say anything, she yelled, "You made him angry." Confusion overwhelmed me as she explained how Tom had followed me, his demeanor shifting from smug to furious in seconds. I wanted to retreat into my own thoughts but couldn't. Her anguish was palpable, igniting guilt for a decision I'd made. "You shouldn't have played that game," she cried, her body trembling. Moments later, Tom stepped out onto the porch, his expression morphing eerily from anger to something chillingly vacant. "This is all your fault," he said, voice eerily devoid of emotion, before he slammed the door shut. It felt surreal, like being trapped in a waking nightmare, where reality began to fray at the edges. The sound of the waves crashing in the distance melded with Chloe's sobs. I attempted to comfort her, but it didn't help. It felt like I was trying to stop a tidal wave with my bare hands. What happened next is a blur. A strange stillness settled in the air, wrapping around us as if the universe itself paused to hold its breath. Chloe's phone buzzed violently, and she snatched it up, eyes widening. "It's Tom," she whispered, trembling. The heavy air thickened as she pressed the phone to her ear. I stood frozen, the world blurring around me as I listened to her end of the conversation. "No. Please, Tom. Don't say that," she begged, her voice breaking. When she finally hung up, her face was drained of color, a ghostly pallor that terrified me. "He's done," she whispered hollowly, and for the first time, I felt fear gripping not only for her but for what lurked just beyond the threshold of normalcy. It turned out that every time I left a room, every time I faltered, it incited a violent reaction in Tom. The shadows had answered his desperation. He wasn't just losing Chloe, he was losing himself, and in that moment, it felt like a dark loop had eclipsed our lives. I felt as if I had stumbled into a living horror story, where the protagonist's decision to run away from danger only served to amplify the horror for those left behind. Days turned into months, and Chloe would later describe that night as the beginning of the end. She could still hear him speaking in tongues, lost in the dark magic of old stories he shouldn't have touched, and somehow I felt responsible. It wasn't a clear-cut evil, no one died that night, but in her eyes, I could see the shadow crawl deeper, and I knew I had done something irrevocable. My heart ached with the weight of knowing that every sob escaping her lips felt like a piece of the blame sinking into my chest. Each encounter felt haunted, and every family gathering turned sour. The laughter morphed into daggers each time I saw Tom in the corner, wearing an expression of abandonment. He unleashed chaos in a white-hot rage, and soon after, their relationship crumbled, but the repercussions reverberated through Chloe's life like thunder. Was I really an asshole for leaving, or was it merely a breath before the descent into madness? It's hard to differentiate what's tangible and what's not when you're marking the boundaries of your sanity. While we navigate the dim corridors of our past longing for the light, sometimes the door you think leads to the safety of the outside world becomes the very breach through which darkness floods in, and the shadows inside you will haunt you long after you think you've escaped. I still wonder whether the real spirits were the stories we buried, too terrified to admit that they lived not only in the shadows of the night but eternally within us. AITA for requesting an explanation for my money being spent without my consent? It started with a casual text from my sister, Emma, asking about some weird charges on my bank statement. At first, I thought she was just being paranoid, but that changed when I saw the numbers myself. I had already been on edge ever since I started to notice odd things around my apartment, items misplaced, food disappearing from my fridge, and the eerie sensation that someone was watching me. At first, I brushed it off as stress from my recently taxing job, but as the charges piled up and Emma discovered 4 mysterious withdrawals totaling over $1,000, I began to quake with a fear that flared deep within me. When I confronted Emma, she appeared genuinely concerned, urging me to monitor my accounts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something foul was lurking underneath. It wasn't just my money at stake but possibly my very security. One night, frayed with the tension, I decided to take action and installed a couple of security cameras around my apartment, small, inconspicuous, and just enough to give me peace of mind. Days passed, and everything seemed normal, until one evening I reviewed the footage and what I saw made my stomach drop, an unknown figure slipping through my back door, their movements too fluid, too practiced. It was a mess of jerky limbs, a shadow that crept between comfort and chaos. My heart raced as I flipped through the clips, finding evidence of this intrusion every night, a routine that felt like a sinister ballet played out on my own floor. I found myself losing sleep over the thought of this uninvited guest, replaying the footage over and over until I began to recognize patterns. He'd always visit around 2 a.m., rifling through my belongings, sometimes even holding my credit card, his face obscured by a cheap mask, but his hands, oh God, those hands, were skeletal, fingers darting like spiders, and it chilled my blood to watch him swipe my card for groceries, for God knows what with my hard-earned cash. I decided I had to do something drastic. Gathering my courage, I called a private investigator who specialized in cases of stalking and theft. After explaining my situation, he seemed just as perplexed, yet assured me he'd find the truth. He assured me I was not alone in this battle, and with my permission, he installed discreet cameras and started monitoring the situation. The next evening, I was jolted from sleep by a loud creak, the unmistakable sound of my back door swinging open. Heart pounding, I turned on the monitor to see the masked figure once more, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another figure, a woman in a flowing white dress, her long hair cascading in waves that concealed her face. They were conversing, low murmurs spilling into the silent night, and for a moment, I could have sworn one of them gestured towards my camera. Was this all just a sick prank? Suddenly, the two turned, and I could see the woman reach out, trailing her fingers over the edge of a knife she pulled from her waistband before wrapping her hand around the figure's wrist. Something deep in my gut warned me that they were no ordinary thieves. This was a premeditated act, some grotesque performance playing out in my living room. I felt paralyzed, half wishing to flee while simultaneously entranced by the surreal nature of it all. Just then, the woman looked directly into the camera, and I swear she smiled, a wide, toothy grin that shattered my nerves into a million pieces. The following days descended into pure madness. I began receiving letters slipped under my door, the kind of letters that feel like a taunt from an unseen adversary. They spoke in riddles and whispered of my past, old secrets I thought I had buried alive, tales of debts I never acknowledged, family issues long resolved, and a chilling prophecy about how my curiosity would be my undoing. Night after night, I received strange deliveries, packages filled with personal items from my childhood, acquired during those hellish break-ins but intended for some twisted purpose only they understood. Then everything came crashing down on an ordinary Thursday evening when I received a chilling text from Emma. "I think they know about us," it read, accompanied by a picture of her home, the same woman from my video standing just outside her window, a finger pressed to her lips, as if to silence her. Panic surged through my body, and I dialed her number, begging to know if she was okay, but when she answered, her voice carried a tremor. "They came to my house, Jamie, asking about you. They said you were supposed to pay the price." Tears streamed down my face, clutching at my phone as she continued, "They told me to tell you to stop investigating or else." The call ended abruptly. I stood in my kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, dread choking me. After that, my world spiraled rapidly into an abyss of paranoia. Every sound morphed into a threat, shadows danced menacingly at the corners of my vision, and the silence was punctuated by an awareness I wished I could escape. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't breathe, trapped in an existential maze of horror. One fateful night, I mustered the courage to confront the twisted reality of my life. I figured if they wanted me, I'd meet them on my terms. I set up a final trap, luring them in with the results of my mounting searches, fake articles about how to win the lottery and the secret to eternal youth. I awoke just past midnight to the unmistakable sound of shuffling by my window. I could barely breathe as I crawled toward the security camera, heart racing, praying one final act would unveil the truth behind all of this. They slipped inside, the woman's laugh cutting through the insistent quiet as she plucked treasures from my drawers, memories, trinkets, possessions that were once dear to me. And then she turned, the mask slipping off her head to expose a face I knew all too well, my own twisted grin reflected in a funhouse mirror, stripped of its humanity. And there, standing beside her, was the very figure I had panicked over, his presence dark and foreboding. I realized, in that heart-stopping moment, that they were me, manifestations of every sin I'd ever committed rising to envelop me, whispering sweet promises of freedom if only I would embrace the chaos. At that moment, my fate lay in their hands, their hollow words chilling me to the bone as they reminded me, "You always wanted to know. I always thought my family was strange, but I never expected that the looming shadow of my father's estate would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and sanity." My father, still alive but battling a relentless illness that had reduced him to a mere ghost of the man he once was, owned a sprawling piece of land, a crumbling farmhouse with more history than charm, and a collection of oddities that filled every nook and cranny of the place. After years of being an outcast in my own family, my brother Alex returned with a gleam in his eye and a desperate need for money, which he insisted my father should have already divided. "He won't need it after he's gone," he told me one night as the shadows gathered in the corners of our dimly lit living room. I felt an odd chill, not from the cold, but from the look in his eyes that seemed almost predatory. He wanted me to agree to sell a portion of our father's land, a decision I found ghastly. I couldn't bear the thought of discussing finances so soon. My father was still with us, albeit slipping away by the day. "You're being selfish," Alex snapped, his voice tinged with a venom that echoed through the stillness. I could hear my father's labored breathing from the next room, a constant reminder that he was fighting his own battles, and in the throes of denial, I clung to what little was left of our family unit. The days that followed grew darker, with my brother returning at odd hours, constantly trying to charm me into seeing things his way, all the while casting angry glances at our father, as if the old man's mere existence was a blight on his plans. Conflicted, I found myself venturing into the attic to escape the familial tension, combing through dusty boxes filled with fragmented memories, discovering strange letters, some of them detailing occult practices that seemed out of place among my father's mundane possessions. Flickering candlelight from an old lantern illuminated my father's poetry, haunting verses about loss and existence, which sent chills down my spine, making me question not just Alex's motives but the very nature of what it means to own something so deeply personal. Then came the night everything changed. I woke to the sound of chanting, low and insidious, echoing through the halls of the farmhouse. In a daze, I stumbled down the creaky stairs, compelled by some unseen force to investigate. The living room was bathed in an eerie glow. Alex stood at the center, surrounded by candles casting elongated shadows that writhed against the walls like living things. His eyes were unfocused, a manic glint shimmering as he gripped a large, intricately carved pentacle that had once belonged to our father, the very emblem of what was left of our family legacy. "You don't understand what's at stake," he pleaded, a frenzy edging his voice as if he were channeling some otherworldly energy. "The estate belongs to us, but not for long if he passes. I need you to help me." Before I could respond, a low thrum reverberated from the floor beneath us, intensifying. My father's anguished groans wafted through the air, merging with the incantations that spilled from my brother's lips, forming a grotesque echo vibrating through my very bones. Paralyzed by fear, I finally found my voice, screaming at Alex to stop, but the words were lost in the hollow space as the lights flickered and the shadows convulsed. It was then that I saw it, the grotesque, distorted face of our father reflected in the window, lips moving in silent horror as if he were begging for release from the grip of his son's madness. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the pentacle, desperately yanking it from Alex's grasp, its edges burning against my palm. The moment I touched it, reality split apart like brittle glass. A cacophony erupted in the room, a sound that scraped the insides of my skull. I was thrown back, landing hard against the wooden floor, breath knocked from my lungs, as shadows swarmed over me with suffocating wrath, eager to consume. The last thing I remember was the sight of Alex, eyes wide with terror, unsure whether to flee or fight against the amalgamation of forces we had unleashed. When I returned to consciousness, the house felt different, heavier, charged with an anxiety I couldn't place. I scrambled to my feet, scanning the room as frail wisps of the past whispered through the air, muddled memories piercing the haze. I found my father in his bed, gasping, the lines on his face deepening as if aged by decades in just hours. Desperate to salvage what remained of my family, I pleaded with him for answers, for something to cling to that wasn't shrouded in fear. Instead, he gripped my hand with surprising strength, a grave expression washing over his features, as he confessed dark family secrets, the endless cycle of greed and loss, a dreadful once-committed pact stretching back generations that led to despair, forever binding us to that estate. My brother had stumbled upon that darkness, and though he thought he could wield it, the truth was evil wasn't meant to be controlled. I raced to find Alex, but he was gone. The house echoed with madness coursing through its walls, crawling in every shadow and corner. I could feel the energy swirling around me, wrapping tighter as though the very land was rejecting me for refusing to play into its sinister game. Alone, forbidden even to call for help, I was left to confront what had transpired, the eerie weight of despair pressing down like an anchor to the abyss. My only choice was to confront the terrifying legacy of my lineage, but I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I resolved to protect my father's estate, to honor his last wishes, even if that meant facing the darkness alone, because I finally understood. Before any of it was mine, it belonged to the shadows beneath the surface, and they would only grow stronger if I followed my brother down that road. AITA for refusing to sell my father's estate and distribute the money? Maybe. But when your brother dances with devils, walking away might just be the only way to survive. I never thought a simple visit to the grocery store would spiral into my own personal horror story, but that's exactly what happened last Wednesday evening when I encountered a mother and her 8-year-old son, a boy who, at first glance, seemed like your typical kid but quickly revealed an unsettling darkness. I was just trying to pick up a few essentials, milk, bread, you know the drill, when I noticed the boy running wild through the aisles, screaming at the top of his lungs, throwing items on the floor like it was his own personal playground. His mother was oblivious, seemingly texting distractedly on her phone while he sprinted down the cereal aisle, knocking boxes left and right. At first, I thought it was amusing, maybe even a harmless little tantrum, but as I watched him shove a box of Frosted Flakes into another shopper's cart, laughter turned to unease. The slap of cardboard hitting tile echoed in the empty aisle, and I felt the adrenaline kick in as he turned to me with eyes wide and wild, a twisted grin stretching across his face that seemed far too old for a child. I glanced at his mother, expecting her to at least scold him, but she just kept scrolling, her expression blank, as if her son's chaos barely registered. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of responsibility creeping in. I approached her, a knot forming in my stomach. "Excuse me," I said, my heart racing even as I attempted to remain calm. "I think you might want to keep a closer eye on your son. He's causing quite the mess." To my dismay, she looked up, annoyance flashing in her eyes as if I were the problem. "It's just a little fun," she snapped, rolling her eyes and returning to her phone, dismissing me in a way that sent chills down my spine. That grin from her son widened, and I swear I felt the temperature drop. Left with no choice, I decided to confront the child directly. After all, children respond to authority, right? "Hey buddy," I said, squatting down to his level, forcing myself to meet his gaze, "how about we help your mom and clean this up together?" His laughter echoed eerily in the silence, and then he took a single step back, looking me up and down with a knowing glint in his eye that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "You can't make me," he said, voice low and steady, way too serious for someone his age. I felt a chill race through me, a primal instinct to back off, but I pushed forward. "You'll get in trouble if you don't behave." For a moment, it seemed like my words had cut through the fog, and I could almost see the gears turning in his head. But then he just laughed again, this deep, guttural sound that echoed through the aisle, and I recoiled, suddenly feeling foolish for even trying. Almost as if the darkness inside him had risen to the surface, he spread his arms, as if preparing for flight, letting out a shriek so piercing it felt like it shattered glass. The commotion caught the attention of a nearby employee, who jogged over, eyebrows raised at the chaos unfolding before him, but as he stepped up to intervene, the boy turned and sprinted in the other direction, darting down the aisle and knocking over a display of snack cakes. In his wake, bewildered shoppers merely stared, shifting their bags and exchanging unsure glances. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I had no idea that feeling would soon become a reality. As the mother finally began to gather her son, I felt a tiny flicker of relief. Maybe she would see reason after all. But as she stepped closer, her face contorted in anger, she aimed her ire at me. "What the hell is your problem? He's just a kid." A deathly silence enveloped the aisle, and I could hear a pin drop as the other customers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and the mother. I could feel my cheeks flush with heat. After all, I was just trying to help. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just a typical grocery store visit anymore, it had turned into something much darker. "He's out of control," I stammered, my voice wavering slightly under the weight of her gaze. "Maybe if you paid attention." But before I could finish my sentence, the boy reappeared behind her, that same twisted grin plastered across his face, but this time, it felt like a veil of malice had descended over the air. "Don't you think she began, but the boy suddenly lunged at me, tackling my legs and causing me to stumble back, the world tilting as I hit the hard floor. My hands instinctively shot out to catch myself, pain sparking up my palms. Glaring up at the ceiling, I caught a glimpse of the kid running toward the entrance, laughter dancing on his lips, echoing in the empty space like a haunting memory. "Get him," I shouted, my voice hoarse as I regained my footing, but my cries were lost in a cacophony of chaos, the mother just standing there in shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was surreal, feeling powerless as the crowd around us erupted into confusion, and I felt a sick realization washing over me. I had crossed a line, had intervened where I should have simply walked away. With each passing moment, tension thickened the air, and soon, I felt the terror of this bizarre scenario settle deeply in my gut. Crazily enough, it all seemed to happen in slow motion. I dashed after the boy just as he slipped out the glass doors, the cool night air hitting my face like a wave of clarity, and my heart pounding in my chest as I shouted again, "Stop!" He raced toward the parking lot, the glow of headlights flickering erratically, but just as I was about to reach him, a strange sensation washed over me, some primal instinct screaming to run away. And then it happened. I caught a glimpse of his eyes, darker than the night itself, seeming to draw in all the light around him, and I felt my body freeze, paralyzed in fear as if some unseen force was holding me in place. "You can't stop me," he said, the childish lilt of his voice twisted into something unrecognizable, and in that moment, I could swear I saw a flicker of malice, no, a flicker of something far worse, deep within him that confirmed my worst fears. This child was not just out of control, there was something inherently wrong with him. Every instinct screamed for me to turn and flee, to escape the darkness that threatened to engulf me, but I was rooted, lost in those eyes that shone with an ancient malevolence, an echo of something that should never belong in a child. I felt the wind whispering warnings to me, but the moment I finally turned to run, I felt a sharp pain straining through my back. Looking down in disbelief, I realized that the boy, I don't even know how, was suddenly upon me, and he had stuck a butcher knife into my side, the world swiftly fading into a crimson haze as pain engulfed my senses. Everything became muffled and distant, the screams, the sirens, the horrified gasps of passers-by became a bizarre symphony, swelling as I crumpled to the ground, the cool concrete cradling me as I gasped for breath, caught in an inescapable nightmare. As I lay there, eyes flickering shut against an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole, I could hear the mother call out to him, "David, come back." But her voice sounded far away, as if it belonged to another world. In my fading moments, my mind was a whirlpool of regrets, of could-haves and should-haves, realizing too late that when the line between innocence and darkness blurs, it is often the innocent who pay the ultimate price. All I started with was a simple commentary on parenting, and now I was just another casualty in a tale nobody would believe. Last Saturday, while the sun cast its late afternoon glow over our modest home, I received a message that would unravel everything I thought was stable in my marriage. It was from Melanie, my husband's ex-wife, and it said she needed a place to crash for a while. My fingers twitched over my phone as I hesitated, recalling the awkward dinners where I plastered a smile on my face while she recounted tales of their life together, stories punctuated with nostalgia that felt like knives twisting in my gut. I caught a glimpse of my husband, Mark, with his dreams of being a father, and I remembered how her shadow loomed over our plans, how he'd sometimes get lost in thoughts of what might have been. I took a deep breath, recalling the bite of jealousy that came with every shared memory, that smirk she wore like a crown, reminding me of her former reign over his heart. I tapped on the screen, whipped it if I told her to find another place. Just as I was about to hit send, I caught sight of Mark returning from the backyard, his hands muddy and a smile on his face, remnants of our future buried just under the surface. There was no response from the group chat, just an empty void of digital uncertainty that gnawed at me. What if they were right? What if I was the villain in this tale? As the day slipped into night, the shadows stretched, morphing and contorting into familiar shapes, weaving my mind into a frenzy of fear and anxiety. I envisioned what my decision could unleash, the ripples echoing into our lives, a thin thread snapping, leaving chaos in its wake. Mark and I sat down to dinner, his friendliness unsettling, and I found myself eating in silence, the tension growing like vines choking a tree. Did he suspect the turmoil I wove inside? My stomach churned at the thought of blurting out my plan. Afterward, as he settled into bed and the house grew quiet, I lay awake, considering every angle until I finally managed to sleep, only to be jarred awake by a crashing noise. My heart raced, I stumbled into the hallway, guided by faint whispers that danced around me. As I approached Mark's study, I saw the door ajar, and the voice that floated through sent chills down my spine. It was Melanie, hushed and conspiratorial, sweet with promises that felt laced with malevolence. I couldn't hear all the words, but the laughter set my blood on fire, and at that moment, the weight of my indecision crystallized into resolve. I would tell her to leave. That night, sleep evaded me as I envisioned the conversation brewing like a storm in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, as Mark sipped his coffee, the sun waking up through the kitchen window, I finally mustered the courage, my blood pounding in my ears. "We need to talk about Melanie," I said, my voice steady but betraying a tremor that he noticed immediately. Mark's eyes narrowed as he pushed the mug away. That was my sign. He listened as I poured out my feelings, how her presence hung over us like a specter, how it embarrassed me, how it twisted the knife deeper every time she smiled at him with that same infuriating warmth. "She needs to find her own place," I concluded, my heart racing in my chest as his expression darkened. Silence enveloped the room, thick and suffocating, a pulse of tension twisting like a living thing. "You don't understand how needful her situation is," he countered, his voice soft but full of brooding sadness, leaving me bewildered. How could he still defend her? My heart sank deeper as he went on about her struggles, the difficult life she had because of our divorce, and the children who lived scattered in the wake of their split. Every word he uttered felt like a sharp blade carving deeper into my resolve. I could feel tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I choked back the helplessness clawing at my throat. But as I stared into his eyes, still sparkling with affection, I realized I couldn't let them reignite the embers of their past. The weeks dragged on, the moments we once cherished were tainted by her lingering presence. I could see it in Mark's furtive glances at his phone, the way he wore an anxious smile whenever her name popped up on the screen. It was then I decided that fear alone wouldn't determine my happiness or his instincts. It had to be gone. Our home became a battlefield of unspoken words and invisible corpses, each day a test of my will. I found myself drawn back to the messages, the ones that had painted her darker than before, a sly predator in sheep's clothing. I reached out to friends who had been sympathetic, listening intently while my confidence solidified. They told me what I had known all along. I deserved a life free from haunting pasts, a love untainted by the ghosts of former partners. It was finally time for confrontation. I had nudged the gears forward and couldn't pull back from the momentum charging through my veins. One afternoon, in the midst of kitchen chaos, I called her. My heart raced as the call connected. Her hesitant voice on the other end was a siren's call that needed shattering. "Melanie, we need to talk," I said, every word dripping with resolve, and through the exchanges, I felt the power shift in my grip. She danced around the subject, veering expertly, but I remained anchored, bringing the topic back to her stay. "Mark and I love each other, and you can't keep crashing here," I said, feeling the tremor of adrenaline coursing through my bloodstream. To my surprise, she laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent icy tendrils snaking down my spine. "You think this is over?" She spoke, silky and twisted. "This isn't your movie, and I'm not going anywhere." I remember that gut-sinking moment when I realized this wasn't merely about space, it was a tug-of-war for dominance. That night, I tried to shake the fear that clenched onto my gut like a vice. I envisioned slamming the door in her face, but it was Mark's words that simmered in my ears. "She's my past," he had told me, like a scar on my soul that can't simply fade. It plagued me every second until the reality set in. I had to act. Just as the sun sank low the following evening, Melanie walked in unannounced. She saw my fury and shrugged like a doll with missing strings. "Can I stay for just one more night?" she crooned, her face plastered with that same smirk that sent nausea churning in my belly. I snapped, my body fueled by primal rage. This was mine, our home. "No. You're done. You've overstayed your welcome," I shouted, my voice breaking the silence with unexpected ferocity. The calmness in her eyes vanished. For a moment, I saw something sinister flash across her face, a sharp edge, a tempest beneath the surface. "You better tread carefully, darling," she hissed, and for an instant, her hand slipped into her pocket, but I stood firm, unwavering. The tension crackled like energy in the air, enveloping us in a precarious standoff. "Get out," I repeated, cold and distant. She regarded me for a moment longer before a slow smile unfurled on her lips that set every hair on my body on edge, the kind of smile that hinted at a deeper madness, a buried threat that rose and fell with every heartbeat. "This isn't over, you know," she said, every word syrupy sweet until she finally turned to leave, and the door slammed shut with an echoing finality. I thought I had won, but as the days turned into weeks, I discovered the true cost of that victory. It wasn't until late one night, sleep evading me again, that I heard the rustling outside our window, so familiar, so haunting. I peered through the blinds, only to find her silhouette lurking across the street, her eyes alight with a dangerous glow. She stood there for hours, unmoving, and in that moment, I felt the walls of my mind closing in. It was then that I realized I hadn't simply pushed her away, I had unleashed a storm far beyond my control. Since that night, my thoughts have been increasingly fractured. Each creak in the house sends my heart racing. I see her lingering everywhere, the grocery store, the park when Mark takes our dog for a walk, even the dinner parties where friends mention her name. I can't shake the feeling that she's watching me, just waiting for the right moment to slip back into our lives like the darkness seeping through the cracks. I wish I could say that I felt free, that I had finally paved a path to happiness, but each day feels like a puzzle piece snapping into place, fraying along the edges. Was I the villain? Did I open a door I was never meant to? The echoes of laughter haunt me in the quiet hours, and as I look into Mark's eyes, I no longer see the warmth I once cherished, all I glimpse is uncertainty. I often wonder if I made a god-awful mistake, and I'm not sure if I can ever escape the shadows she left behind, or worse, if she will eventually come back for what she believes is hers. The claims of an ex haunt me now like whispers in the dark, and for the first time since we said, I do, I fear I might lose him to her still. Every Thanksgiving, I felt obligated to attend my aunt's annual dinner, a tradition that started before I was even born, but this year felt different, almost oppressive. It was a routine gathering embellished with family feuds and stories of past mischief, but a thick air of something ominous clung to the dining room. As we sat down, the scent of roasted turkey mingled with something disconcertingly sour, a smell I could not quite place. My eyes landed on the side dish Aunt Helen had brought, a massive casserole of what she called Thanksgiving surprise. Something about its texture, the way it glistened under the dining room lights, made my stomach churn. It looked almost like it had been reheated, the edges crisped just enough to hint it might have spent more than a few days in her fridge, or maybe worse, her basement. It wouldn't be the first time I had suspicions about Aunt Helen's cooking. Last year, I remembered swallowing dry turkey while she told me about her magic spice she sprinkled in everything, but nothing that magical came to mind when I examined her last-minute concoction. She caught me looking, her eyes narrowing, and suddenly a wave of guilt washed over me. "You're not going to try my special dish?" she asked. The way she said it felt almost like a challenge, and I felt trapped in the moment, everyone staring expectantly, utensils poised, ready to dive into their plates like eager wolves. I hesitated, a million thoughts colliding in my mind, the family outcast for not trying Aunt Helen's cooking versus potential illness. Instead of answering, I politely said, "I'm full." My lie hung in the air like the sweet potato casserole quietly baking in the oven, and for a moment, you could feel a collective shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of bonds that were already fraying, an unseen weight pressing down on us all. Aunt Helen laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, it echoed strangely in the room, tinged with something unsettling. "Oh, sweetie, there's always room for family," she insisted as she scooped a heaping spoonful onto my plate anyway. I could feel my face flush, the need to say no battled by the pressure of familial obligation. My heart raced as I pushed the plate away, a plea to my mom for help dancing in my eyes. She merely shrugged, seemingly lost in her own food coma, and Aunt Helen's vibe shifted to something predatory. I was suddenly acutely aware that I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her cooking, the dish itself looking far too stale, too out of place, and an echo of horror rose up within me. She had a reputation for experimenting, especially with her more unconventional recipes. Trusting my instincts, I politely declined once more, repeating my mantra about being full, yet Aunt Helen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "You know you can't not eat it. It's special, like our family." A chill ran down my spine, a clear implication that unwillingness wasn't merely an option. My plate, sitting there, so innocently menacing, suddenly became a focal point of dread, and I could feel the eyes of my relatives on me, their longing to see tradition upheld clashing with my rising panic. The moment stretched on indefinitely, Aunt Helen's expression morphing from a faux sweet smile to something that sent a tremor through my spirit, a frown laced with unyielding expectation and a hint of malice. Somewhere deep inside, I felt her frustration swirling like a storm, and I suddenly remembered stories, whispers, that Aunt Helen had experimented with unusual ingredients before, substances that could only be described as unique, maybe even dangerous. In a moment of clarity, I could imagine the casserole magically becoming the centerpiece of her questionable culinary adventures. Perhaps she had unearthed a recipe passed down through the generations, one made with something far too bizarre to be served at a standard family gathering. My stomach turned again as the fear bubbled over. I couldn't shake the image of her examining her creation in her dimly lit kitchen, the sounds of her cackling laughter dancing with the phantom memories of the dishes I had once consumed, turning sour and abandoned long before Thanksgiving. The tension broke only when my cousin Joey made a joke that landed flat, but the deflection only caused Aunt Helen to fisher. The silence grew loud and thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions until she snapped, "You'll eat it. It's not Thanksgiving without my special dish." With each insistence, I could feel the pull of tradition choking me like a stranglehold, gnawing at my resolve, pipes of familial loyalty clinging to me as if refusing to let go. I felt the eyes of relatives proclaiming judgment, silently questioning if I would survive another year without indulging Aunt Helen's craving for pressuring me to devour it. One bite, I convinced myself, just one. Finally, I mustered some courage, my hand trembling as it reached for the serving spoon, and then I froze, caught mid-movement, my imagination racing ahead, scripting the silent horror play of what could happen if I surrendered, for what if the dish was made of despair? What if I, too, fell prey to the ancient recipe, consumed by whatever vile secrets lay within? "Aunt Helen, I just can't," I finally stammered, glimpsing the anger surging in her eyes before I reluctantly blurted out the truths I had bottled up. "I can't eat things that have been sitting around. What if it's bad?" The room went deathly quiet, tension crackling like electric current. Aunt Helen's face morphed from frustration to an eerie calm, a chilling smile stretching across her features. "Oh, sweetie," she cooed, and I think I detected a touch of satisfaction beneath that sugar-coated voice. "You have no idea what's good for you, do you? This recipe is an heirloom passed down through generations, a commitment of love and sacrifice." In my gut, dread swirled with pure terror as the world fell away, Aunt Helen morphing into an almost fiendish apparition desperate for me to partake in her eerie legacy. The air surrounding me felt apparent with sinister undertone, and every muscle in my body screamed to get away from that table as I heard the whispers of cousins muttering behind me, "Are you really going to challenge her? Family comes first." Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the lights flickered, and a horrible realization washed over me. They all seemed to be bound to this sick ritual, a cycle fueled by hidden secrets and untold sacrifices. Then Aunt Helen continued, her voice low and almost seductive, "You think we're all just here for the food, don't you? But it's the dish that binds us, keeps our family together through everything, including those who, let's say, didn't make it to the end of the feast last year." A cold shiver crawled up my spine, and a sickening clarity washed over me, a dark understanding fretting at my sanity as I envisioned an empty chair at the table, last year's dinner where a cousin had simply vanished. Was it possible that something more sinister was cooking beneath that surface? The thought propelled me to my feet, my stomach rebelling against me in scathing protest. "I can't," I screeched, the words pouring out of me like molten lava. "I refuse." I bolted for the door as Aunt Helen's chilling laughter echoed behind me, a sound I was convinced would haunt me forever. I rushed outside, my breath leaving me in sharp gasps and my mind racing, picturing the plate of Thanksgiving surprise, the voiceless screams it held, the lingering stench of something rotten that tainted not just the casserole but maybe everything about our family. I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't turn back, couldn't be ensnared in whatever dark web Aunt Helen had woven, and I'd sooner fast until Christmas than find out just how far she would go to preserve her twisted legacy. I stumbled into the night, knowing I would be the family outcast in their eyes, but anything was better than feasting on the horrors of last year. As the darkness closed in around me, a thrill of freedom coursed through my veins, and yet, a lingering question remained, would I be the one uninvited next year, or would the casserole have its appetite satisfied before another Thanksgiving crept upon us? Thanksgiving had always been a family affair in my house, but this year felt different. This year, my husband eagerly announced his friend might be bringing her dog to dinner. Her dog, a strange hybrid mix of some kind of terrier and things I couldn't even identify, had a penchant for mischief, and as someone who had witnessed the aftermath of its chaotic visits in the past, I immediately felt a chill creep down my spine. From the moment I said no to the canine inclusion, an unseen tension crackled through the air like static electricity, my husband's face darkened, and a silenced argument bubbled beneath the surface. "It's just a dog," he'd insisted, but I couldn't shake the memories of Thanksgivings past where that little beast had devoured half of my cousin's pie and shredded a pillow beyond recognition while the adults were too distracted by football to notice. Besides, there was something unsettlingly unnatural about how that dog would stare at me from the corner of the room, its dark eyes boring into my soul, as though it were waiting, watching, plotting. In the days leading up to the dinner, I was met with accusations of being a dog-phobe, and while I had nothing against dogs in general, there was something profoundly off about this one. When Thanksgiving Day finally arrived, I found myself setting the table with a sense of dread, the silence of my reluctance hanging thick in the air. As my husband and his friend arrived, I noticed she wore this bizarre, almost victorious grin, as if the anticipation of chaos fueled her swagger. "You didn't really think she would have to leave her dog behind, did you?" She chuckled, throwing me a look that sent a shiver down my spine. The door swung open, and Toby, a name the dog bizarrely longed for, pranced into the house, his small body wiggling eagerly. I felt a knot form in my stomach as it darted around, sniffing everything, as if cataloging my life's most precious belongings. Dinner progressed amid the usual laughter and chatter, but I couldn't focus, my unease festered like a wound. That dog, now settled like a predator on a distant rack of bones, would occasionally fix me with its unsettling gaze, and each time I caught it watching me, the atmosphere warped around us. I started hearing whispers in the shadows, hushed tones that sent an ice-cold tremor through my bones, as if conversations were happening just out of sight, echoing thoughts that were never spoken aloud. The friendly barking morphed into something darker as the hours rolled on, and laughter turned hollow, every cheerful exchange gouging deeper into my consciousness, replacing comfort with creeping dread. At one point, while serving turkey, I looked up only to see Toby at my feet, staring, his pupils dilated to a menacing sliver. In that very moment, the power flickered, plunging us into darkness before the lights stubbornly returned, and suddenly it wasn't just the dog watching me, it felt as if something else lurked beneath the surface, hidden yet glaring. My eyes skimmed across the room, grasping for a shred of normalcy, only to lock onto Toby, who now seemed frozen, his body tense, poised as if preparing for something unspeakable. I forced a laugh when my husband and his friend joined me, but everything felt warped, strange, unsettling, a distortion of reality wrapped in familial love. When the dessert arrived, I felt the vibration of panic crawl through my fingertips as I skimmed across the table. I had baked a pumpkin pie my grandmother used to make. Just as I placed the pie down, Toby darted forward like a sprinter at the starting gun, sending the beautiful piece of pie flying to the ground, shattered into an unrecognizable mess. Everyone gasped, laughter dissolving into disbelief as my husband yelled, "Toby, no!" My pulse quickened, and in that instant of chaos, I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, a silent signal that something was horribly wrong. The dog wasn't just clumsy, he was deliberate, and I desperately shouted, "Get that thing outside!" Something in my voice snapped through the tension, and as Toby was whisked away, I turned to see my husband's friend buckle in response. The joy she'd entered with had morphed into something closer to rage. "What's wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice suddenly low, laced with venom. The rest of the night was a blur of hurried movements and strained silences, the air humid with unspoken tension, until I finally noticed the flickering lights again, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. The whispers grew, now harsh and chaotic, mocking me, taunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling we were trapped in some cruel play, and that little dog, no, that creature, was pulling the strings. Just as I thought the worst was over, the front door swung open, and I caught sight of Toby again, alone, sitting eerily still on the porch, head cocked at an angle, as if he had a message to deliver. My blood ran cold, an instinctual fear curling within me, and the room fell silent as everyone turned. "Where's your friend?" I choked out, my voice trembling. Just then, the atmosphere shifted, a cloud of apprehension flooded over us, washing away any last ounce of warmth. I glanced at my husband, only to see his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "She's got to be joking, right? She didn't go out there, did she?" he gasped, his mind racing. Time seemed to slow down. I had unintentionally opened a door to something dark and unfathomable, and as panic mounted, I braced myself in silence, a haunting thought spiraling within my mind. What had come into our lives alongside Toby? I kept searching for my husband's friend, but it felt as if she had vanished into the ether, a specter hidden among shadows. My heart raced wildly, the whispers louder now, seemingly orchestrating my descent into dread. I gathered the courage to open the front door, and what I saw snuffed the last flickers of hope from my mind. There, on the porch, was Toby, but the dog wore a face unmistakably adorned with blood, brighter than the crimson hues of falling leaves. What happened next unraveled everything. The shadows conspired, my husband stepped out, and in that instant, the world twisted, the line between human and beast blurred. I stood frozen as a deafening howl pierced the night. The laughter of my family became grotesque, mocking me, pulling me deeper into the oblivion. AITA. My once warm Thanksgiving dinner dissolved into echoes of despair, leaving me to wonder if my simple refusal had unleashed something far darker that lay nestled in the shadows, forever altering our lives, forever horror-drenching my innocent hopes. When I first moved into my tiny two-bedroom apartment with Clara, I was excited to finally have a place of my own, an escape from the oppressive atmosphere of my childhood home. Clara was friendly and welcoming, and we bonded over our shared love of late-night baking marathons and binge-watching true crime documentaries. Everything was great until one evening, when I got home late after a long shift at the diner and decided to whip up a batch of cookies to unwind. The smell of chocolate chip dough rising in the oven felt like home, familiar and comforting, but just as I pulled the tray out, Clara's voice cut through the sweetness of the moment. "Can we talk?" she asked, her expression serious, which struck me as odd. I set the warm cookies on the cooling rack and sat down at the small kitchen table, eager to hear what was bothering her. Clara lowered her voice, as if someone might overhear us, and said, "I need you to promise me you won't use the oven again." My heart dropped, the request clawed at my mind, a bone-chilling whisper of unreasonableness. "What? Why?" I asked, incredulous. You just can't," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Every fiber of my being wanted to dismiss her, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Is this about your weird family back home?" I pressed, remembering the odd traits she'd shared, like her great-grandfather's obsession with farming the land even after moving to the city. Clara's gaze suddenly turned distant, like a clock unwinding. "It's for your own good," she said quietly, and that's when I noticed how her hands were clenched into tight fists, her knuckles white against the faded oak of the table. I tried to reason with her, tell her that in all my previous apartments, I'd always used the oven, it was essential, the heart of my culinary dreams. But Clara remained firm, almost fearful. So, night after night, I reluctantly complied. My meals became monotonous, leaning heavily toward microwave dinners and takeout, leaving the oven untouched and the rich aroma of baked goods locked away in my yearning heart. I could feel the tension building, so I decided to do some digging and looked through the boxes Clara had left unpacked since the move. I found an old, dust-covered cookbook bound in frayed leather that caught my attention, dog-eared and marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. Flicking through pages, I discovered handwritten notes and a hurried scrawl that spoke of rituals, of family traditions lost to time, and warnings against the oven being a portal of sorts, a gateway for something sinister. That night, I tentatively approached Clara as she flicked through channels, eyes glazed, and asked her about the cookbook. Her face turned pale, she snatched it from my hands, growling, "You shouldn't have looked at that." I recoiled, and she suppressed a sob as if she were about to spill secrets wrought with anguish. "What is happening, Clara?" I urged, but she shook her head in the manner of a child being lectured, whispering about how the oven shouldn't be used, how it belonged to a legacy far darker than we could comprehend. As the days dragged on, wrapped in her escalating mania, I finally lost my patience. It was a Thursday night, and I needed to bake something, anything, to reclaim my sanity. I woke up in the dead of night with an insatiable hunger for something freshly baked. Quietly, I crept into the kitchen, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and leaned over the counter where my food scale and mixing bowls lay patiently. Ignoring my better judgment, I started to gather my ingredients. I turned the oven knob, feeling a sense of rebellion surge through me, and that beautiful glow flickered to life, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. As I mixed together the batter, I could have sworn I heard something in the distance, a whisper echoing from deep within that old cookbook. The moment my cookies started to brown, the shelves rattled under an invisible force. Confusion flooded my senses, maybe it was an earthquake, or perhaps Clara had returned. But as I peeked through the window into the deep ink of midnight, I saw her. She was standing in the darkness of the courtyard, her back to me, whispering in a language that was sharp and foreign. I felt the door swing open behind me, a gust of wind that carried Clara's scent, something floral yet cold, like autumn leaves. I spun around, heart pounding, only to find the oven door flung wide open, steam billowing out like ethereal smoke. As I leaned forward, horrified, I noticed that my beautifully baked cookies had transformed into grotesque, burnt shapes, almost as though they were alive, broken shells shrieking silently in my mind. A low growl reverberated from the oven, the temperature surged, and the shadows coalesced into a swirling mass. The realization hit me swiftly. Clara had been keeping me from using the oven for a reason, a warning cloaked in paranoia. I reached for the cookbook, my fingers trembling, but Clara appeared behind me, her face twisted, fury and sorrow etched into her features. "You weren't supposed to see," she shrieked, and as I turned, the shadows seemed to reach out, lunging toward her. She stumbled backward, nails clawing at the wooden floor, a scream pouring from her lips as the darkness enveloped her. I was frozen in shock as she was dragged into the abyss of the oven, the growls intensifying, final echoes of her terror haunting the air. I blinked and found myself alone, the kitchen illuminated eerily by the oven's light. The cookbook lay open on the table, words shifting like quicksand, warning me, never again. My heart raced as a burning rage ignited within me. Yet, the overwhelming dread remained. I staggered back, staring at the melted remnants of the cookies that felt like pieces of souls. I stumbled out of the kitchen, breath quickening, feeling Clara's absence like a chasm in my chest. I don't think I will ever truly understand what happened that night. Days passed, and I couldn't bring myself to open the oven again. I lived off cold meals, the silence echoing in the apartment, and every time I caught a glimpse of the cookbook, its call now tainted with dread, I felt a presence lurking within its pages. I've tried to move on, but whispers follow me, warning me that the oven's portal is still alive, a void waiting to swallow more. Now, every time I hear a knock on my door or see a shadow dart in the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder if Clara is still out there. I still hear her voice sometimes, calling softly, begging for help against the darkness, a darkness I helped unleash by breaking a promise. So, here I am, AITA for wanting to use the oven, or is she still watching from whatever realm those shadows had taken her to, forever reminding me of what the oven truly holds? I need to share something that happened to me recently, and let me tell you, it's been haunting me ever since. I, 24, male, was living with my roommate, Sarah, 22, female, in an apartment that came with limited parking spaces, so we both had a parking pass we needed to display to keep our vehicles safe from being towed. Now, at first, everything seemed fine, but it didn't take long for Sarah's behavior to change. Picture this, every night she'd come home late, sometimes after midnight, after what she said were long shifts at her second job, which I didn't mind until I started noticing that she was leaving her car parked without the pass displayed, even though I'd reminded her at least a dozen times. The first time I noticed it, I told her to park in our designated spot and put the pass up. She waved me off, claiming she would handle it, but as weeks turned into months, the same pattern played out. Her car would sit there, vulnerable and ominously unchecked. I think deep down I knew that ignoring the rules and parking without a pass was what made her feel rebellious, but the threat of a tow loomed over both our heads, and I started to get anxious every time I saw her vehicle in its usual spot without the pass, yet when I confronted her, she'd brush me off like I was the unreasonable one. It escalated the night I saw a tow truck pulling into the lot. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. I could see the driver scanning for offenders, and a chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the hallway. I had a choice to make. I won't lie, I mentally calculated the consequences for both of us, lose her car or confront her again, but knowing Sarah, I could picture her obnoxious eye rolling every time I brought it up, so in that moment, I made the decision. I followed that tow truck. Through the glass door, I watched as they got out and approached her car. My heart raced as I jogged down the stairs, desperate to stop them, but it was already too late. They had it lifted off the ground, and in that moment, I felt a pitiful mix of satisfaction and impending regret. I'd done what I thought was right, but the backlash I anticipated didn't take long to arrive. The next morning, I woke up to find Sarah standing over me, her face pale with anger, and she wasted no time accusing me of being the sole reason her car was gone. I tried to explain how many times I had warned her, how this was purely a consequence of her choices, but she kept accusing me of sabotaging her life and ruining her independence. She even went as far as saying I was taking pleasure in her misfortune. I told her that if she had just followed the rules, we wouldn't be here. That evening, her attempts at getting her car back only compounded her frustration when she learned that her parking pass had been revoked as well. In her fury, she vowed to make my life miserable, and I didn't take her seriously until the creepy stuff started happening. She'd come home late and drop heavy items on the floor to wake me up, blasting music with absurdly loud bass to keep me from sleeping, and I'd find my refrigerator contents rearranged or the dishes dirty when I'd cleaned them just the day before. I thought I was being paranoid until one night, while I was curled up trying to block out the noise with my headphones, I heard her whispering outside my door, saying my name in this eerie sing-song voice that sent chills through my spine. It was as if she was summoning something sinister. I confronted her about it, but she just laughed, saying she was testing my sanity. That was when I began noticing odd occurrences. One of my PS4 games went missing, only to later appear in her room, and when I asked her what it was doing there, she merely shrugged and claimed it found its way. Friends on social media started checking in on me, asking why I looked so tired all the time, and I eventually began sleeping at a friend's house after noticing that she would watch me while I slept, her eyes glimmering strangely in the darkness. I figured I would come clean to anyone that would listen about the awful situation, but my friends thought I was the weird one. I felt isolated, trapped in an apartment that now seemed haunted by her twisted perspective. The turning point came weeks later when I found out that an old mutual friend of ours went missing after reaching out to Sarah, claiming they needed to talk. I immediately tried to talk to her about it, but she just dismissed my concerns, telling me it had nothing to do with her. It was then, in a panic, I decided to check her texts and discovered that she had sent cryptic messages about someone transcending and being free along with a strange timestamp that mirrored the night my friend disappeared. My gut told me something sinister had happened, but the moment she caught me snooping, it was like unleashing Pandora's box. The next day, I woke up to find my belongings trashed. Somehow she snuck in during the night, and I panicked. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the battery was dead. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized it was only a matter of time before she would come back, and based on what I saw in her texts, I knew I had to escape before my life turned into a living nightmare. The following night, I snuck out, clutching a single duffel bag, but when I reached the parking lot, I was greeted by the harrowing sight of her car parked, with the driver's seat illuminated, even though this time she was nowhere to be seen. I hesitated, but the only way I knew I could protect myself was to leave, so I bolted to my car, only to be peppered by a deafening laughter echoing back from the direction of the apartment. Never have I felt terror like that, knotting through my stomach as I drove through the night, and even now, weeks later, I keep looking over my shoulder, paranoid that she followed me or that somehow, I've let something dark linger, but I still wonder if I went too far by getting her car towed, regardless of whatever captivating madness her psyche had devolved into, and the looming question remains, was I the villain in this twisted tale, or just a victim entangled in a nightmare? I never thought I'd be that guy who gets grossed out by his girlfriend, but here I am, sitting in my dimly lit bedroom, heart racing and palms sweaty, wondering if I'm overreacting or if there's something genuinely disturbing about the situation. My girlfriend, Lisa, is the kind of woman who could light up a room with her laughter. She's bright, funny, and has this magnetic smile that drew me in the moment we met at that dive bar last summer. But lately, something else has been drawing my attention, and it's not as pleasant as her charm. It started small. She'd skip washing her hair for a day or two, saying she liked the natural oils or didn't want to ruin her waves, but after a few weeks, it became clear to me that this was more than just a beauty routine, it was an outright neglect. I hesitated, thinking maybe it was a phase or some personal statement she was making about embracing herself, but by week 3, I couldn't ignore the pungent odor that lingered in the air after she left the room. It was like the smell of damp earth mixed with something rancid, and I tried to brush it off as a trivial inconvenience. We'd hang out at my place, and out of desperation, I would spray air freshener when she wasn't looking, hoping she'd catch a whiff and feel compelled to wash up, but instead, she just kept piling on the dry shampoo, like it was some magical solution. One night, we were on the couch, cuddling while watching a movie, and I caught a whiff that made me gag, subtle but thick enough to linger, and I couldn't help but pull away. The look she gave me was one of confusion and hurt, as if I had slapped her across the face, and that was the moment I knew I had to say something. "Lisa, can we talk?" I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think you need to wash your hair more often." I braced myself for a fight, but instead of anger, she just laughed, that carefree laughter that had enchanted me so many times, now tinged with disbelief. "You're kidding, right? It's just hair. Who cares?" But I could see her self-assurance crack a little, the laughter not reaching her eyes. The days turned into weeks, each one more unbearable than the last. As we spent time together, her hair became a distressing presence. It was always stringy and looked like it was home to a family of grease rats. I felt disgusting just sitting next to her. Friends and family began to notice too, dropping pointed hints that couldn't go unaddressed. At dinner, my sister casually asked, "Are you okay, Lisa?" You're not looking your best lately. I felt that crushing embarrassment swell in my chest, the ball of conflict growing larger every time I pulled Lisa close. One night after work, I walked into our apartment, fully ready to be hit by that noxious cloud she now carried like a perfume, but what greeted me was oddly still. The whole place felt off balance, eerily quiet, and I immediately feared the worst. I wandered through the dim light, finding her bedroom door slightly ajar. I nudged it open, revealing the bed a mess of clothes and crumbs, but no Lisa. A sickening knot formed in my stomach as I turned to check the bathroom. The moment I stepped inside, reality twisted in a sickening way. The mirror was fogged up, and her hairbrush sat abandoned on the countertop, but where was she? The thought struck me like a lightning bolt that maybe she'd finally cracked. I found myself pacing the room, mind spiraling with worries, until I noticed the open window, and then I remembered something. She had mentioned a friend down the street hosting an art exhibit that night, so I grabbed my coat and rushed out, panic driving my feet. Arriving at the gallery, the vibrant colors painted walls contrasted sharply with the raw anxiety gnawing at my insides. I scanned the crowd, searching for her face, but found only strangers chatting and sipping wine. A wave of unease crashed over me. Where could she have gone? Just as I was about to text her, something deep within me prompted me to check the restroom. I pushed through the throng of bodies moving like a tide toward the bar, and as I reached the flickering light of the restroom sign, my breath caught in my throat. I could hear muffled laughter from inside, and I paused, my heart pounding. Forcing the door open, I stepped inside, and there she was, standing in front of the sink, her hair splayed out like a tangled mess, a friend from work, Jennifer, beside her. They both stopped laughing when they saw me, and the moment of silence hung heavy in the air, thick with all the things left unsaid. I stood frozen, my mouth working but unable to form words. "What's wrong, babe?" Lisa said, tugging a strand of greasy hair behind her ear, the innocence in her voice cutting deeper than any knife. My thoughts raced as I looked back and forth between the two of them. There was something unsettling about the way they were giggling, the way Lisa couldn't seem to feel the weight of the revolting crust forming on her scalp. Then Jennifer leaned closer and whispered something that sent chills racing down my spine. "It's only hair, right? It's like art, the messier, the better." Just like that, panic morphed into a visceral horror, and I stumbled backward, suddenly understanding that this wasn't a phase, this wasn't just about hygiene, but something far more sinister I hadn't grasped. An hour passed, and I was sitting outside, shivering not from the chill of the night, but the creeping realization that I couldn't be with someone who had willingly chosen to let themselves go so profoundly. I could hear the muffled noise behind me, laughter ringing out, but it all felt distant, strange. What kind of life did I want? Was I disgusted because I actually thought she was disgusting, or was my disgust a reflection of my own expectations of normalcy? When I went home that night, I tried to shake it off, but all I could think was that I felt trapped in a relationship that had dove deep into the abyss, her carefree attitude now looming over me like a shadow, leaving me pondering how far I would have to go to escape this tangled mess of love and revulsion. I texted her, "We need to talk," and waited, the screen flashing with those 3 little dots, and when she finally replied, it felt like the exhale I'd been holding for too long. "Can we talk about your hair?" I typed, my fingers trembling, but the response came quickly, and all at once. I wondered if it was really worth it to try and salvage what was left of us. AITA for being disgusted that my girlfriend doesn't wash her hair for weeks. The loneliness devoured me, as I realized I was getting sucked into the whirlpool of our differences, fighting with a growing sense of dread that maybe, just maybe, I'd be forced to choose between love and a life governed by a cleanliness I once took for granted. I'm writing this because I'm terrified, and I need to share my story before it consumes me. It all started innocently enough. My mother-in-law, Diane, was a well-meaning woman, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself in the years we spent feigning cordiality while navigating her unpredictable rages. A few weeks before her death, when she was confined to a hospital bed after a sudden heart attack, she let slip her plans for her will. We sat there, my husband and I, sipping weak coffee in that sterile waiting room, our expressions shifting from bored to tense as she rambled on about the 5 timeshares she insisted were a gift from the heart. 5 timeshares, 1 in the Bahamas, 2 in the Smoky Mountains, and 2 in Oregon, all racking up an eye-watering total of $9,500 in annual fees. We had explicitly told her we couldn't maintain such burdens, especially since we were trying to stabilize our own lives after the pandemic, but she had become a different person. In her fevered state, she grew angry, her voice rising until the monitors beeped in protest, spitting out an array of frantic notes, and as they moved to stabilize her, I felt something shift in the air. We lost her a day later, and with her went those ominous plans like a dark storm cloud hovering over us. When we gathered with the family days later to read the will, her attorney handed over a neatly typed paper outlining her loving gifts. I felt the blood drain from my face as I scanned the page, but as I looked around the room, none of my in-laws seemed to flinch. Their expressions were almost gleeful, like they were satisfied with her eccentric logic. I turned to my husband, gauging his reaction, but he was silent, a muscle twitching at his jaw. That's when I felt my gut twist. Did they know something I didn't? I brushed it off, thinking that maybe this was her outrageous way of keeping us tied to her legacy. Yet, as the days passed, keeping up with anonymous letter after letter from the timeshare companies demanding payment, I began to feel something lurking in the shadows. The first sign I noticed was at our doorstep, a heavy package wrapped in a dark, coated paper with no return address. I opened it to find an ominous leather binder embossed with an insignia I didn't recognize, a serpent intertwining with a skull, each letter ominously fading into the worn edges. Inside, an old photograph showed timeshares with figures that looked hauntingly familiar. My heart raced as I flipped through, affirmation of Diane's haunting grip still latching onto us, grinning maliciously through the ages. I felt the chill of unseen eyes, and it escalated to a weekly affliction. Every Monday, more packages arrived, and with them, an ever-deepening dread. They held strange notes, requests that revealed an unsettling trend. Each note dished out threats about some familial pact that had gone unfulfilled, with instructions no one could decipher. It claimed that we would own not only the timeshares, but also their dark histories, leading us to confront shattered memories of the past I didn't know I was connected to. My husband became a shell of who he was, slowly deteriorating under the pressure of family whispers, and it broke my heart to watch as he no longer found solace in our home. We fought more, and nights devolved into silence as we each lay awake, haunted. Then, one night while unpacking a new round of letters, I stumbled upon something even darker, a crudely drawn map with arrows leading to the bases of the timeshare properties, each one marked with an X. As I studied it, the atmosphere in the room thickened, and I could hear my husband yelling at something invisible. He was in a fit, begging for whatever dark presence to leave us alone as he drew back into that despondent spiral. I watched in horror as the glow around him dimmed. Suddenly, he wasn't himself anymore. The land where we thought we would craft memories had begun to consume us, revealing secrets that had long lingered in the shadows. We tried cutting ties, but the letters became more menacing, each threatening paragraph ushering in a new realm of despair. Then came the nightmares. They were vivid, bringing echoes of Diane standing at the edge of a storm-lashed beach, her laughter twisted and echoing as though she enjoyed watching us writhe in agony, and each night, it felt like we were being pulled into an abyss where neither of us could escape. My husband grew distant, wrapped in unfathomable darkness until one evening I woke up to find him gone. Panic set in as I searched everywhere, only to find the door ajar, leading to the open night air where the moon hung heavy. It was at that moment I realized he had become entrapped in the very thing Diane had left us, a cursed possession disguised as a gift. I ran toward the beach as fear surged through me, and at the water's edge, I caught sight of him standing there, entranced by something in the distance. I screamed, but the waves drowned me out, and by the time I reached him, his eyes were glazed over, filled with a stirring malice that raised my hair and froze my breath. It wasn't him anymore, it was something sinister wearing his skin as the ground trembled beneath me. I stumbled back, realizing that Diane's gift was more than financial, it was an unholy legacy. Now, every time a package arrives, every whisper from our family or sighting at our doorstep sends chills washing over me. I can't tell what's real anymore, and as the letters demand my husband's soul, I feel the tide rise, cleaving our fates, one letter at a time. So here I am, terrified and alone, begging for someone to believe me, drowning in the legacy she intended for us, an inheritance of which we never asked. But now it feels like we've entered an irrevocable deal with the dead, and each passing day, I fear I will wake up at the water's edge and find him gone forever, consumed by the darkness, forever tangled in the serpent's embrace.